At our engagement dinner, my parents handed my fiancée a $900,000 bill claiming I owed them for raising me. She squeezed my hand as I opened 7 years of proof and whispered, "Now they pay." My name is Harrison. I am 34 years old, and I work as a supply chain logistics manager in Chicago. For my entire life, my parents, Richard and Patricia, made sure I knew my exact place in the family hierarchy. I was the safe, boring disappointment. My older brother Trent was the visionary, the golden child who could do no wrong. But tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to be about my future, not my past. Tonight was about Claire. We were sitting in a private booth at one of the most exclusive steakhouses in downtown Chicago. The kind of place where the mahogany walls absorb the sound of polite conversation, and the waiters wear white gloves. I had booked this table 3 months in advance to celebrate our engagement. Claire sat beside me, her diamond ring catching the low ambient light of the crystal chandelier above us. She looked beautiful, radiant, and completely unaware of the storm that was about to break over our lives. Across the table sat my parents. Richard wore a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. Patricia sat perfectly straight, a string of heavy pearls resting against her collarbone. They had spent the first 2 hours of dinner dominating the conversation. Richard boasted about his golf handicap and the new country club renovations, while Patricia offered thinly veiled critiques of Claire's wedding plans. Every time Claire mentioned a venue or a floral arrangement, Patricia would offer a tight, sympathetic smile and say something about how quaint and modest that sounded, reminding us that Trent had hired a celebrity event planner for his launch party last year. I swallowed my frustration with every bite of my steak. I was used to this. I had spent a lifetime building a quiet, stable life specifically to insulate myself from their endless need for status. I did not need their approval, but I wanted this one night to be peaceful for Claire. As the waiter cleared our plates and poured the last of the Cabernet Sauvignon, a heavy silence settled over the table. This was the moment. The traditional time for the patriarch of the family to raise a glass, offer a toast to the newly engaged couple, and welcome the future bride into the family. I looked at my father. Richard did not reach for his wine glass. Instead, he reached inside his tailored jacket. He pulled out a thick black leather binder. It was the kind of portfolio corporate lawyers use during high-stakes acquisitions. He set it on the pristine white tablecloth. The heavy thud it made seemed to echo in the small space. He placed his hand flat on the leather cover and slowly pushed it across the table toward Claire. I frowned, confused. For a brief, naive second, I thought it was a gift. Perhaps it was a deed to a property, or a collection of family heirlooms, or even a financial contribution to the wedding. I reached out and opened the cover. It was an invoice. A literal itemized bill printed on heavy bond paper with my father's personal letterhead at the top. The bold letters across the first page read, "Statement of debt for rearing and development of Harrison." My brain completely misfired. I stared at the columns of numbers trying to process what I was looking at. The document was meticulously organized by year starting from my date of birth. It listed estimated costs for food, housing, electricity, and clothing, but it did not stop at basic necessities. There were line items for orthodontic expenses in middle school. There were transportation fees for driving me to soccer practice. There was a charge for the portion of the family vacation I attended when I was 12. I flipped the page, my hands beginning to tremble. The charges grew more absurd. There was an entry labeled Opportunity Cost of Parental Time. Below that was a flat percentage fee applied to every year titled Fiduciary and Parental Management Fee. At the bottom of the final page, the grand total was printed in bold red ink. $900,250. I looked up, my throat suddenly, bone dry. I looked from the paper to my father. Richard was sipping his wine, his expression completely blank, as if he had just handed me a quarterly earnings report. "What is this?" I asked. My voice came out as a raspy whisper. Patricia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She did not look at me. She looked directly at Claire. The polite societal mask she had worn all evening melted away, revealing the cold, calculating cruelty underneath. "We know your family has money, Claire," Patricia said. Her voice was smooth, completely devoid of emotion. "Your father owns that lovely manufacturing firm in Ohio, and you are his only daughter. We expect this invoice paid in full before you marry our son. He has been a financial burden to this family long enough. It is time he clears his ledger." The air in the booth vanished. I felt like I had been punched in the chest. I looked at Claire. Her eyes were wide with shock, her gaze darting from the absurd document to my mother's icy face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You cannot be serious," I said, my voice rising. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "You are billing me for raising me. You are trying to extort my fiancé's family at our engagement dinner." "Do not use that tone with us," Richard snapped, placing his glass down firmly. "We provided you with a premium lifestyle. We invested heavily in your upbringing, expecting you to take a lucrative path like your brother. Instead, you chose a mediocre career in logistics. You failed to provide a return on our investment. Since you are now marrying into substantial wealth, we are simply calling in the debt. Consider it a dowry in reverse." I felt a sickening wave of heat rush through my body. The sheer sociopathy of the conversation was paralyzing. They were sitting in a public restaurant calmly demanding nearly $1 million for the crime of my existence. They viewed me not as a son, but as a failed financial asset that they were finally liquidating. "I am not paying you a single cent," I said, my voice shaking with raw anger. "And you will never speak to Claire about her family's money again. We are leaving." I signaled the waiter, who had been hovering nervously near the edge of the booth. I pulled out my wallet, my hands trembling violently, and withdrew my premium corporate credit card. I dropped it onto the leather check presenter. "Just run it," I told him. "Bring the receipt quickly." The waiter nodded and hurried away. I turned to Claire and told her to grab her coat. I refused to look at my parents. I just wanted to get Claire out of that room, away from the toxic poison that was my family. I wanted to apologize to her, to promise her that we would never have to see them again. A minute later, the waiter returned. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. He held the black tray out to me. "I am so sorry, sir," he whispered. The card was declined. I frowned, snatching the card back. "That is impossible. I have a $30,000 limit on that card, and the balance is zero." I pulled out my personal debit card and handed it to him. "Run this one." The waiter hurried off again. The silence in the booth was suffocating. I could feel Richard watching me. When the waiter returned a second time, his face was pale. "Declined again, sir. The terminal said to contact your banking institution immediately." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my chest. I pulled out my phone and quickly logged into my banking app. The screen loaded and my stomach completely dropped. Across the top of my checking, savings, and brokerage accounts was a bright red banner. "Account frozen. Administrative hold." I stared at the screen, unable to comprehend how this was happening. Then I heard a soft, dry chuckle. I looked up. Richard was smiling coldly, adjusting his silk tie. "Did you really think I would hand you a bill without securing the collateral first?" Richard asked. "How did you do this?" I demanded. "You were always so careless with details," Harrison Richard said, leaning back against the leather booth. "When you were 18, I co-signed your first college checking account at the National Bank. You never closed it. You just stopped using it and opened your adult accounts at the same institution. This afternoon, I walked into my private branch. As a joint account holder, I flagged the account for suspicious activity and filed a formal familial financial dispute regarding unpaid debts. Because all your accounts are under the same banking umbrella, the bank's automated cross-collateralization protocol froze your entire financial profile pending an investigation." "You froze my money," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Just a temporary hold," Richard replied smoothly. "It will take you weeks of bureaucratic nightmares to untangle it, assuming I do not escalate the claim. But it gives you time to think. It gives you time to realize how incredibly vulnerable you are without us." He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Patricia stood beside him, picking up her designer clutch. Have your new family wire the funds by Monday, Harrison, Richard said, looking down at me with absolute contempt. Otherwise, things will get much more difficult for you. Have a good night. They walked out of the restaurant, leaving me sitting there in a state of total devastation. The waiter stood awkwardly nearby, the unpaid bill still resting on the table. I had no money. I had no access to my accounts. I had to look at my fiancée, the woman I loved more than anything in the world, and borrow her credit card to pay for our own engagement dinner. Claire did not say a word. She quietly paid the bill, took my hand, and led me out of the restaurant. When we stepped outside, the sky had broken open. A cold, heavy Chicago rain was pouring down, washing over the neon lights reflecting on the wet pavement. We stood under the restaurant awning, waiting for the valet to bring my car. I felt completely hollowed out. The anger had been replaced by a deep, terrifying dread. My parents had just orchestrated a calculated surgical strike on my life, and I had no idea how far they were willing to go. The drive home was suffocatingly silent. The rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers was the only noise in the car. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept running through the scenario in my head, trying to figure out how to break the bank freeze, trying to figure out how to protect Claire from the fallout. I felt a deep, burning shame. I had brought her into this madness. We pulled into the parking lot of my condominium complex. The rain was coming down harder now, blurring the streetlights. I parked the car and we walked in silence toward my ground floor unit. I was exhausted. I just wanted to get inside, lock the door, and figure out a plan in the morning. But as we rounded the corner to my front porch, I stopped dead in my tracks. The porch light was on. Standing under the glow of the bulb was my older brother Trent. He was wearing an expensive trench coat, his arms crossed over his chest, a smug, satisfied smirk plastered across his face. Standing right next to him, kneeling in front of my front door, was a man in a blue uniform with a heavy drill. It was a locksmith. The deadbolt on my front door was already removed, the metal shavings scattered across my welcome mat. I dropped my briefcase, the rain soaking through my suit. The nightmare was not over. It was just beginning. The rain was coming down in sheets heavy and freezing, bouncing off the concrete walkway that led to my front door. My heart was already pounding from the disaster at the restaurant, but the sight waiting for me on my own front porch made the blood freeze in my veins. Under the harsh yellow glare of the porch light stood my older brother Trent. He was 36 years old, impeccably dressed in a tailored camel hair overcoat, holding a massive golf umbrella over his head to protect his perfect hair. Trent was the golden child of the family. He was the founder of a flashy tech startup in downtown Chicago, a company that constantly issued press releases and hosted lavish launch parties but produced absolutely nothing of actual value. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on. To them, Trent was a visionary. I was just the guy who moved freight for a living. But Trent was not alone. Kneeling in front of my door was a man in a damp blue uniform. He was holding an industrial drill, and the screaming whine of metal grinding against metal pierced through the sound of the rain. It was a locksmith. He was drilling directly through the brass deadbolt of my home. "Hey!" I shouted, sprinting up the walkway and leaving Claire a few steps behind me. "What do you think you are doing? Get away from my door!" Trent did not even flinch. He turned to me with a slow, arrogant smile, his eyes tracing up and down my soaked suit. He looked completely unfazed, as if he were simply waiting for a valet to bring his car rather than committing a home invasion. "Right on time, Harrison Trent," said his voice smooth and dripping with condescension. "Though I see you forgot to pay the dinner bill. Mom and Dad were very disappointed you threw such a tantrum at the restaurant." I stepped onto the covered porch, water dripping from my face, my fists clenched at my sides. "Tell this man to stop right now," I demanded, pointing at the locksmith who ignored me entirely and kept drilling. "This is my property. You are breaking and entering. I will call the police right now." Trent laughed. It was a sharp, grating sound. He reached inside his expensive coat and pulled out a folded legal document, casually tapping it against his palm. "You could call the cops, little brother," Trent said. but they are just going to look at this emergency lien and tell you this is a civil matter. You do not own this property anymore, at least not right now. You are officially locked out." I stared at him, the panic from the restaurant returning with a brutal force. "What are you talking about? I bought this condo myself. The mortgage is in my name." Trent shook his head slowly, clicking his tongue as if he were scolding a toddler. "Did you forget about the promissory note, Harrison? 10 years ago, Mom and Dad gave you $20,000 to help with the down payment on your first starter apartment before you bought this place. They had you sign a formal promissory note. I paid them back. I yelled, the memory flooding back. I paid them back every single cent within 3 years. I worked overtime every weekend to clear that debt." Trent smirked. "Did you get a signed release of lien? Did you make them legally destroy the original document?" "No, because you are careless. You just transferred the money into their account and assumed it was over. Mom and Dad still hold the original notarized note. And since they are now claiming you owe them for a lifetime of unpaid expenses, they filed that note with the county this morning. They attached 10 years of compounded interest, late fees, and penalties. Combined with the administrative freeze they put on your bank accounts, a judge granted an emergency receivership to secure their collateral." The locksmith pulled his drill back. The heavy brass deadbolt fell onto the welcome mat with a dull thud. The locksmith quickly slid a brand new lock cylinder into the hole and began tightening the screws. "You cannot do this," I said, my voice cracking. The sheer scale of their betrayal was incomprehensible. They had planned this. For weeks, maybe months, they had orchestrated every single detail. They waited until the exact night of my engagement dinner to spring the trap, ensuring my maximum humiliation and total financial ruin. "It is already done," Trent said smoothly. "The property is secured." Trent then shifted his gaze past me. He looked at Claire, who was standing at the edge of the porch, the freezing rain soaking her dress and ruining her hair. She was shivering, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at my brother in absolute horror. Trent smiled at her, a predatory, sickening smile. "I am sorry you had to find out this way," Claire, Trent said, raising his voice so she could hear him over the rain. "But you need to know exactly who you are marrying. My little brother has been a leech his entire life. He has spent 34 years siphoning off my parents' wealth, taking their money, living in homes they paid for while giving absolutely nothing back." "Stop talking to her," I warned him, taking a step forward. Trent ignored me completely. He kept his eyes locked on Claire. "He is a loser, Claire. A total loser who finally needs to pay his tab. My parents built a premium life for him and he squandered it on a dead-end career. Now that he has found a woman from a wealthy family, he thinks he can just walk away and let her family foot the bill for his existence. You are marrying a parasite, Claire. He is just looking for a new host. If you have any brains at all, you will take off that ring, call your father, and run as fast as you can." I lunged forward, grabbing Trent by the lapels of his expensive cashmere coat. I shoved him hard against the brick wall of the porch. The umbrella tumbled out of his hands, clattering onto the wet concrete. I said, "Shut your mouth!" I roared, my face inches from his. Trent did not look scared. He just smiled wider, showing his perfectly white, veneered teeth. "Do it, Harrison," he whispered. "Throw a punch. Assault me right in front of your fiancée. Give me a reason to have you arrested tonight. It will just prove everything Mom and Dad told her parents." My hands shook violently against his coat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to hit him, to wipe that arrogant, entitled smirk off his face. But I heard Claire behind me. "Harrison, no," Claire pleaded, her voice trembling with cold and fear. "He wants you to do it. Let him go. Please." I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe. I slowly uncurled my fingers and stepped back, releasing his coat. Trent casually smoothed his lapels, entirely unbothered. The locksmith cleared his throat. "All done, sir," the man said, keeping his head down. He handed a pair of shiny silver keys to Trent. Trent pulled a thick money clip from his pocket and peeled off several crisp $100 bills, handing them to the locksmith. "Thank you for your prompt service. You can go now." The locksmith quickly packed up his tools and hurried away into the rain, eager to escape the tension. Trent took the new keys and stepped toward my front door. He slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door clicked open. He pushed it wide, revealing the warm, familiar interior of my home. The home I had bought. The home I had furnished. The home where I had planned to carry my future wife across the threshold. Trent stood in the doorway, blocking my path. "I need to get my things," I said, my chest heaving. "I need my clothes. I need my files." "Absolutely not," Trent replied, resting his hand on the doorframe. "The contents of this property are currently under legal review to assess their value against your outstanding debt to the family. You are not allowed to remove any assets. If you need a change of underwear, you can contact our family lawyer on Monday and schedule a supervised visitation." He looked at my leather briefcase, which I was gripping tightly in my right hand. "In fact, I should probably confiscate that briefcase right now," Trent noted. "But I am feeling generous tonight. Consider it a parting gift." "You are a monster," I said. "You and Richard and Patricia. You are all completely insane." "We are collecting a debt," Trent corrected calmly. "Business is business. You have been a financial burden for 3 decades. Now it is time to pay up. Welcome to the real world, little brother." Trent stepped entirely inside my condo. He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with absolute triumph. "Have a good night in the rain, Harrison." He slammed the heavy wooden door squarely in my face. The sound of the new deadbolt sliding into place was like a gunshot in the quiet, rainy night. I stood there on the welcome mat, the freezing water dripping from the roof onto my shoulders. I was locked out. I had no access to my home, my clothes, my computer, or my financial documents. My bank accounts were frozen solid. I had absolutely nothing to my name except the wetsuit I was wearing, my leather briefcase, and the keys to my car in my pocket. I turned around slowly. Claire was still standing in the rain, completely soaked, her beautiful engagement dress plastered to her skin. Her makeup was running down her cheeks, but she was not crying. She was just staring at the locked door with a look of pure disbelief. I walked down the steps and stood in front of her. The shame was suffocating. I had spent years trying to protect her from the toxic reality of my family. I had downplayed their greed, their narcissism, their endless hunger for control. I had convinced myself that if I just kept my distance, they could not hurt us. I was completely wrong. They had destroyed my entire life in less than 3 hours. "Claire, I am so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I am so sorry I brought you into this. I did not know they would go this far. I had no idea." Claire reached out her hands, freezing cold, and grabbed my face. She looked directly into my eyes. Her gaze was not filled with pity or regret. It was filled with fierce, determined strength. "We are not talking about apologies right now," Claire said firmly over the sound of the rain. "You have nothing to apologize for. Your brother is a psychopath and your parents are criminals. Right now, we just need to get out of the cold." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "We need to get to the car," I told her. "We will drive to a cheap motel on the highway outside the city. I think I have a $100 bill hidden in my car manual. It will be enough for one night. We will figure everything else out tomorrow." I took her hand and we ran through the dark, flooded parking lot toward my sedan. The rain was unrelenting, chilling me to the bone. I unlocked the car with my key fob and we practically fell into the front seats, slamming the doors shut against the storm. I immediately started the engine and cranked the heater to maximum. It blasted cold air into our faces for a few agonizing seconds before finally warming up. Claire rubbed her arms, her teeth chattering slightly. I took off my soaked suit jacket and tossed it into the back seat, feeling utterly defeated. I leaned my head back against the steering wheel, taking a deep, shuddering breath. I tried to mentally calculate my next move. I needed to call a lawyer, but I had no money for a retainer. I needed to call my boss to explain the situation, but I knew my parents would likely target my job next. They wanted me entirely broken. They wanted me crawling back to them, begging for mercy, willing to sign whatever extortion paperwork they put in front of me. I lifted my head and shifted the car into reverse. I just needed to get Claire to a warm room. That was the only priority. Suddenly, there was a loud, sharp tapping sound right next to my left ear. Tap, tap, tap. I jumped, startled. I turned my head. Trent was standing in the pouring rain right outside my driver's side window. He had walked all the way across the parking lot from the porch. His expensive umbrella was tilted against the wind. I felt a surge of pure rage. I pressed the button to roll down the window, lowering it just 2 inches. The freezing rain immediately blew into the car, hitting my face. "What else could you possibly want?" I growled, glaring at him through the narrow gap. "You took the house. Leave us alone." Trent did not speak. He did not smile. He simply raised his free hand and slid a thick, heavy manila envelope through the 2-inch gap in the window. The wet paper slapped onto my lap. Trent took a step back from the car. "See you in court, little brother," he said loudly over the storm. He turned around and walked casually back toward my stolen home, the umbrella shielding him from the weather. I stared down at the thick envelope resting on my damp trousers. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely peel open the metal clasp. I reached inside and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. The first page was stamped with the official seal of the Cook County Circuit Court. I read the bold, black text at the top of the page. It was a formal legal summons, a civil complaint. The plaintiffs were listed clearly as Richard and Patricia. The defendant was me. I read the charges rapidly, my vision blurring. Breach of implied contract, fraudulent conversion of parental assets, unjust enrichment. They were demanding the immediate repayment of $900,250 plus legal fees and punitive damages. My parents were not just trying to scare me. They were not just making a dramatic point at dinner to extort Claire's family. They were officially suing me. They had initiated a full-scale legal war to crush me into total submission. They wanted me bankrupt, homeless, and permanently indebted to them for the rest of my life. I stared at the summons, listening to the rain pound against the roof of the car. The trap was perfectly laid. They had all the money, all the power, and all the leverage. They thought I was just the quiet, boring logistics manager who would fold under the pressure. They thought I was an easy target. They had no idea what was waiting for them inside a rusted steel firebox at a storage unit just 10 miles away. They had no idea that for the past 7 years I had been holding the match that could burn their entire fake empire to the ground. I looked at Claire. She was looking at the lawsuit in my hands. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot, driving into the dark, rainy night. The worst night of my life was about to become the beginning of their absolute ruin. I woke up to the sound of a garbage truck backing up outside our window. The cheap motel mattress was thin, and the air in the room smelled like stale bleach and old cigarette smoke. Claire was still asleep beside me, her breathing quiet and shallow. I lay there staring at the brown water stains on the ceiling, feeling the crushing weight of the previous night pressing down on my chest. It felt like I was waking up inside a nightmare that refused to end. I reached for my phone on the scratched wooden nightstand. I opened my banking application, praying to whatever was listening that the administrative freeze had been a mistake or a temporary glitch. The red warning banner from last night was gone. My heart leaped with a brief second of hope. Then I looked at the actual account balances. There was just a number. 0. My checking account was at 0. My savings account was at 0. My emergency fund was at 0. Richard had not just frozen the accounts. As the primary co-signer on that ancient college account, he had executed a complete withdrawal of all my funds before the bank opened for regular business. Every single dollar I had saved from 15 years of working in supply chain logistics was completely gone. He had drained everything. I needed to clear my head. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could. I put on my damp trousers and wrinkled dress shirt from the night before, grabbed the room key, and walked out into the freezing morning air to get our overnight bags from the car. I thought I could at least change into a clean shirt from my gym bag in the trunk. As I rounded the corner of the motel building, my blood ran completely cold. 2 uniformed city police officers were standing next to my dark gray sedan. A heavy-duty tow truck with flashing yellow lights was already backing into the parking space, its metal hooks lowering toward the front tires of my vehicle. I jogged over, immediately raising my hands to show I was not a threat. "Excuse me," I said, my voice tight and raw with panic. "That is my car. What are you doing?" The taller officer turned to look at me, resting his hand casually on his heavy utility belt. "Are you Harrison?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, stepping closer. "That is my vehicle. I have the keys right here in my pocket." The officer shook his head and pulled a metal dispatch clipboard from his heavy winter jacket. "No, sir, it is not. This vehicle is registered to a man named Richard. He reported it stolen early this morning. We located it tracking the license plate through the toll cameras." I stared at him, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the lie. "That is impossible," I pleaded. "He bought that car for me 10 years ago. I made every single monthly payment on it. I pay the insurance premiums every month. It is mine." The officer looked at me with a mixture of professional boredom and slight pity. "I do not care who made the monthly payments, son. The physical title of the vehicle is in Richard's name. He holds the legal ownership. We have a verified sworn report of grand theft auto, and we are impounding the vehicle to return it to the legal owner. Hand over the keys right now, or we will have to detain you for possession of stolen property." I tried desperately to explain. I told them about the engagement dinner. I told them about the illegal lock change on my condominium. I told them my father was a sociopath trying to ruin my life because I refused to pay a fake invoice. The officers did not care about my story. They were just doing their job based on the official paperwork in front of them. The humiliation burned the back of my throat like battery acid. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my electronic key fob, and handed it over to a total stranger. I stood in the gritty, cracked asphalt of the motel parking lot and watched the tow truck drag away the last physical piece of my independence. The flashing yellow lights disappeared down the street. I had no home. I had no money. And now I had absolutely no way to move around the city. I walked back into the motel room. Claire was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with the thin blanket pulled around her shoulders. I told her what happened. She did not cry or panic. She just reached out, held my hand tightly, and told me we would survive this together. I told her to stay in the room and lock the door securely. I needed to get to work. My job was the one thing they could not touch. I was a senior manager handling $30 million freight contracts. I was highly respected there. If I could just get to my desk, I could use my corporate account to hire a lawyer. I could secure an emergency advance on my salary. I could fix this disaster. I walked 3 long blocks to the nearest public bus stop. I rode the crowded, noisy city bus for 45 minutes, surrounded by people drinking coffee and reading the morning news on their phones. I stood holding onto a cold metal pole in a wrinkled, rain-stained suit, feeling like an absolute ghost. Every jolt of the bus felt like another physical blow to my dignity. But I kept telling myself to stay focused. I just needed to get to my office. When I finally arrived at the towering glass and steel building of my logistics firm, I walked straight to the security turnstile in the lobby. I pulled out my corporate identification badge and tapped it against the electronic scanner. A loud, harsh buzz echoed through the marble lobby. The light on the scanner flashed a bright, angry red. Access denied. I frowned and tried again, wiping the badge on my sleeve. Red light. Access denied. The security guard behind the main desk, a man I had greeted every single morning for 5 years, actively avoided looking at my eyes. He picked up his desk phone, dialed a brief extension, and then stepped out from behind his podium. "Sir," he said quietly, keeping his distance. "Human Resources requested that I escort you directly to their office on the 14th floor the exact moment you arrived." My stomach hit the floor. The cold dread from the motel room returned, spreading through my veins like ice water. I followed the guard to the executive elevator. We rode up in absolute silence. I was not taken to my department. I was not allowed to see my team or check my emails. I was led straight down a long, quiet hallway into a windowless corporate conference room. Sitting at the long mahogany table was Diane, the stern director of human resources, and Robert, the vice president of operations and my direct boss. Robert looked physically ill, staring down at his legal pad. Diane had a thick manila folder resting squarely in front of her. "Sit down, Harrison," Robert said. His tone was heavy and formal, completely devoid of the usual friendly warmth we shared. I took a seat, placing my hands flat on the smooth table to hide my violent shaking. "What is going on, Robert?" I asked. "Why is my security badge deactivated?" Diane opened the thick folder. "We received a very disturbing phone call this morning, Harrison. It was from your mother, Patricia." She followed up the phone call with several forwarded legal documents and police reports. I felt the air violently leave my lungs. "My mother called you?" I asked, my voice rising in sheer disbelief. "Diane, my family is attempting to extort me. They locked me out of my home last night and stole my vehicle this morning. Whatever she told you is a complete and utter fabrication." Robert shook his head, refusing to meet my gaze. "She did not just make a verbal claim, Harrison. She sent over a formal legal summons filed in county court this morning. The official documents state that you are currently under criminal investigation for severe financial elder abuse. They allege you systematically drained over $900,000 from their private retirement accounts over the last decade to fund a secret gambling addiction." I stared at him, my jaw tight. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. They were projecting their own extortion onto me. They were using the exact dollar amount of the fake invoice they handed me at dinner to frame me as a desperate criminal. "Robert, you know me," I pleaded, leaning across the table toward him. "I manage $30 million in sensitive freight contracts for this company every single quarter. I have never misplaced a single dime. You know my character. You know my work ethic. You know this is a malicious lie." Robert finally looked me directly in the eye. The deep pity in his gaze was honestly worse than anger. "I want to believe you, Harrison. I really do, but you know the strict nature of our business. We hold federal shipping contracts. We are subject to rigorous government compliance audits and high-level security clearances. We absolutely cannot have a senior manager under active legal investigation for felony financial abuse. The corporate liability is catastrophic. If our clients found out, we would lose our operating licensing overnight." Diane folded her hands on top of the manila folder, her face completely stoic. "Company policy is very clear on this specific matter, Harrison. Effective immediately, you are placed on indefinite administrative suspension. This suspension is without pay pending the final resolution of your legal proceedings. Suspended without pay." I repeated the terrible words, tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. "You are cutting off my salary based on a single malicious phone call from my mother. We are acting on a filed legal summons involving nearly $1 million in alleged fraud," Diane corrected sharply. "We need you to surrender your corporate laptop, your company mobile phone, and your physical access keys right now. You are not permitted to contact any company clients or vendors. You are not permitted to enter this building. If you are eventually cleared of these charges by a court of law, we will formally review your employment status. But until then, you are no longer acting on behalf of this firm." I sat frozen in the ergonomic chair. The walls of the room started to spin. My parents had thought of absolutely everything. They knew that if I had my salary, I could afford to fight them. They knew that if I had my corporate network, I could find an attorney to untangle the mess. They did not just want to sue me in a courtroom. They wanted to amputate my ability to survive in the real world. They had completely severed my access to food, shelter, transportation, and income in a single coordinated military strike. I reached into my leather briefcase. My hands felt completely numb, as if they belonged to someone else. I pulled out my company laptop and set it gently on the table. I took my corporate cell phone from my pocket and placed it right next to the computer. I stood up. My legs felt like solid lead blocks. Harrison Robert called out softly as I turned toward the heavy wooden door. "I am truly sorry. Get this sorted out, please." I did not answer him. I could not bring myself to speak. If I opened my mouth, I knew I would have broken down completely, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. I walked out of the conference room. The security guard escorted me to the elevator, rode down to the main lobby with me, and watched closely as I walked through the sliding glass doors out onto the busy street. The cold wind bit right through my wrinkled shirt. I stood on the sidewalk surrounded by thousands of people rushing to their warm offices, grabbing hot coffee, living their normal, secure lives. I was 34 years old. I had played by the rules my entire life. I paid my taxes. I worked late hours. I saved my money faithfully. And in less than 24 hours, my own flesh and blood had reduced me to absolute zero. I had no job. I had no home. I had no car. I had no money. I was completely invisible. I started walking aimlessly down the concrete sidewalk. Because they had confiscated my mobile device, I had to use a public payphone inside a dirty transit station to call Claire. I remembered her number by heart. She answered on the very first ring. I told her I was coming back to the motel, but that it would take me a while because I had to walk to the train station. I told her I lost the job. She gasped sharply but quickly composed herself, telling me to just get back to her safely. The journey back to the cheap motel on the outskirts of the city took 2 grueling hours. Every single step felt heavier than the last. My leather dress shoes were ruined from the muddy puddles. My mind kept spiraling into dark, terrifying places. How were we going to eat tomorrow? How were we going to pay for the motel room when checkout time arrived? My parents had designed a perfect prison of poverty, fully expecting me to crawl back to their massive estate and surrender my life to them. When I finally reached the motel, I pushed open the flimsy door to our room. Claire was sitting on the very edge of the unmade bed. The moment I saw her face, my own heart stopped beating. All the color had completely drained from her cheeks. Her hands were shaking violently as she gripped her cell phone tight against her chest. "Claire," I said, rushing over to her and dropping to my knees on the carpet. "What is wrong? What happened?" She looked at me, her eyes wide with a pure terror I had never seen before. She could not speak. She simply handed me her phone. The screen showed a paused voicemail. The caller identification displayed her father's name. Claire came from a deeply conservative, immensely wealthy family in Ohio. Her father was a strict, old-fashioned industrialist who valued public reputation and social standing above absolutely everything else. He had always been skeptical of me, thinking I was not ambitious enough for his only daughter. But he had given his blessing because he saw how genuinely I loved her. I pressed play on the voicemail and put the phone to my ear. The voice of Claire's father boomed aggressively through the small speaker. He did not sound like the composed businessman I knew. He sounded panicked, furious, and completely betrayed. "Claire, you need to call me back the exact second you get this message," her father shouted through the recording. "Richard and Patricia are sitting in my living room right now. They drove to Ohio this morning. They just handed me a massive dossier of police reports and legal filings. They told us everything. They told us about the secret gambling debts. They told us about the massive fraud. They told us that Harrison has been stealing from their retirement to fund his lifestyle, and that the authorities are preparing to indict him today." There was a brief pause on the recording, and I could clearly hear Claire's mother crying softly in the background. Her father's voice returned harder and much colder than before. "You pack your bags immediately. I am sending a private car to Chicago to pick you up. The wedding is permanently canceled. If you stay with this criminal, I will cut you out of this family entirely. Call me back right now." The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I lowered the phone slowly. The silence in the dingy motel room was absolute. My parents had not just burned my life to the ground. They had crossed state lines to poison the only safe harbor we had left. They had executed a flawless, targeted character assassination to ensure Claire's family would disown her if she stayed with me. They were trying to strip away the only person in the world who still believed in me. We left the dingy motel immediately. Claire used her emergency credit card to rent the cheapest compact vehicle available at a local agency because my own car had been stolen by the police under my father's forged orders. The drive from Chicago to her parents' estate in Ohio took 6 agonizing hours. The entire journey was cloaked in a heavy and suffocating silence. I kept my hands gripped tightly on the plastic steering wheel, staring blankly at the endless stretches of gray highway. My mind was racing, but I was completely running out of solutions. I had lost my home. I had lost my job. I had lost my savings. Now I was terrified I was about to lose the only person left in my corner. Claire's family estate was located in an exclusive gated community just outside of Columbus. The property was massive, sitting on 10 acres of meticulously manicured lawns with a long and winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees. Under normal circumstances, arriving here felt intimidating. Today, it felt like pulling up to an execution block. I parked the cheap rental car near the towering front doors. We walked up the stone steps together. Claire did not even bother to knock. She pushed the heavy oak doors open and we walked directly into the grand foyer. William and Victoria, the parents of my fiancée, were waiting for us in the formal living room. William was a deeply conservative industrialist who had built a massive manufacturing empire from the ground up. He valued reputation, discipline, and social standing above absolutely everything else in the world. He was standing near the massive stone fireplace, his posture completely rigid, his face drained of any warmth. Victoria was sitting on the edge of a pristine velvet sofa, clutching a lace handkerchief, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Resting squarely in the center of the glass coffee table was a thick black leather binder. It looked exactly like the one my father had pushed across the table at our engagement dinner just one night ago. Claire dropped her purse onto a side chair. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "Whatever Richard and Patricia told you this morning, it is a lie. They are trying to ruin him because he refused to pay some insane invoice they invented. You have to listen to us." William did not look at his daughter. He kept his cold, furious gaze locked entirely on me. "Step away from him," Claire William commanded. His voice was completely devoid of its usual paternal affection. It was the voice he used when terminating toxic employees. "Mr. William, please." I started holding my hands up in a gesture of surrender. My parents have orchestrated a massive, coordinated attack on my life. They froze my bank accounts. They locked me out of my own condominium. They called my employer and had me suspended from my job. They are trying to destroy me, and now they are trying to manipulate you. William scoffed a harsh and bitter sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the living room. "Do you honestly expect me to believe that, Harrison? Do you hear how completely insane you sound right now? Why would a wealthy, respectable high society couple like Richard and Patricia drive all the way to Ohio just to sabotage their own son? They came into my home in tears. Your mother sat right where Victoria is sitting and sobbed into her hands. They came here to warn us. They begged us to save our daughter before you drained her trust fund just like you drained their retirement accounts." He reached down and picked up the thick black binder from the coffee table. He slammed it back down on the glass with a loud, violent crack. "They did not just bring wild accusations," Harrison Williams shouted. "They brought a fully documented dossier. They brought undeniable proof of exactly who you really are. You are not a reliable logistics manager. You are a predator. You are a con artist with a severe gambling addiction, and my daughter is nothing but your next mark." I felt a sickening wave of heat rush through my body. A con artist, a gambling addict. The sheer sociopathy of my parents was staggering. Trent and Richard had not just fabricated a story. They had manufactured an entire alternate reality and backed it up with fraudulent paperwork. "Show me," I demanded, stepping forward. "Show me what they gave you." William flipped the binder open. His finger pointed aggressively at the first page. "Here are bank statements from the last 4 years," he read aloud. "They show dozens of wire transfers from your parents' private accounts to offshore sports betting syndicates. Your father claims you forged his signature to authorize these transfers. And here is a timeline generated by a private investigator they hired. It shows that you researched Claire's family background, including the exact structure of her inheritance trust, 3 full weeks before you supposedly met her by pure chance at that charity gala. That is impossible. I yelled the injustice of the lie burning my throat. I met Claire because I spilled coffee on her coat in a hotel lobby. It was a complete accident. Those bank statements are forged. You have to know they are forged. I do not even know how to place a sports bet. And what about this? William interrupted, turning the page. Here is a copy of a police report filed this very morning in Chicago. It states you are currently under criminal investigation for felony elder financial abuse. It states your employer suspended you immediately after reviewing the evidence. Are you telling me the Chicago Police Department is also lying? Are you telling me your corporate human resources department is part of this grand conspiracy against you? I stood there completely paralyzed. The trap they had built was absolute perfection. Every single action they took over the last 24 hours was designed to feed directly into this exact smear campaign. They froze my money, so I looked desperate. They got me suspended, so I looked guilty of corporate fraud. They filed false police reports, so there was a permanent paper trail. Society always believes the wealthy, composed older couple over the frantic, unemployed young man with frozen bank accounts. Harrison is a good man, Claire screamed, stepping between me and her father. I have known him for 3 years. He works 60-hour weeks. He lives modestly. He treats me with nothing but absolute respect. You cannot possibly believe this garbage over the man I'm going to marry. Victoria stood up from the sofa, fresh tears streaming down her face. Oh, Claire, my sweet girl. Victoria sobbed, reaching out toward her daughter. They warned us you would say that. Patricia told me how deeply he has manipulated you. She told me how he isolates you, how he plays the victim, how he makes you feel sorry for him. So you will open your checkbook. Please, darling, we are trying to save your life. Do not throw your entire future away on a criminal. I am not a criminal, I said, my voice cracking under the massive weight of their judgment. I loved your daughter the moment I saw her. I never asked her for a single dime. I paid for the engagement ring with my own savings. I paid for my own condominium. I have worked for everything I have ever owned. Then why are your accounts frozen? William demanded, stepping right into my personal space. Why are you standing in my home in a wrinkled suit driving a cheap rental car paid for by my daughter? Your own brother Trent told me how you lived off their generosity for decades. He runs a successful technology firm while you scrape the bottom of the barrel, constantly begging your parents for bailouts. You are a parasite, Harrison. You found a rich girl to attach yourself to, and your parents were decent enough to come here and stop you from draining our family dry. The word parasite echoed in my head. It was the exact word Trent had used on my front porch the night before. They had rehearsed this. They had synchronized their dialogue to ensure maximum psychological damage. William closed the binder and crossed his arms over his chest. The verdict was final. He had made his decision, and there was absolutely no room for debate. I am giving you an ultimatum, Claire, William said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You will take that ring off your finger right now. You will hand it back to this fraud, and you will ask him to leave our property. If you do that, we will hire the best security firm in the state to ensure he never comes near you again. We will protect you. And if I refuse? Claire asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. If you walk out that door with him, William said coldly, you are no longer my daughter. I will call my attorneys this afternoon. I will have you completely removed from the family trust. I will disinherit you completely. You will not receive a single dollar of my wealth, and you will not be welcome in this house ever again. You will be completely on your own with a man who will undoubtedly abandon you the moment he realizes your bank accounts are empty. The room fell into a deathly silence. The only sound was Victoria weeping softly on the velvet sofa. I looked at Claire. She looked incredibly small, standing in the middle of that massive, opulent living room. She was wearing the same clothes from the night before, her hair still messy from the rain, her eyes wide with shock. I looked at the grand chandelier hanging above us. I looked at the expensive oil paintings on the walls. I looked at the safety, the security, and the legacy that she had known for her entire life, and then I looked down at myself. I was 34 years old, completely broke, legally locked out of my home, facing a criminal investigation and publicly branded as a con artist. My parents had won. They had successfully stripped me of everything, including my basic human dignity. They had made me utterly toxic. If Claire stayed with me, she would lose her family. She would lose her inheritance. She would be dragged down into the mud, forced to fight a legal war against a family of wealthy sociopaths who had unlimited resources to destroy us both. I loved her too much to let her become collateral damage in my family's twisted game. I took a slow, deep breath. The pain in my chest was so sharp it felt like cracked ribs. I reached out and gently touched Claire's arm. "Claire," I whispered, my voice completely broken. "You need to stay here." She turned to look at me, her eyes widening in sheer panic. "Harrison, no." "What are you saying?" I stepped back, putting distance between us. "I cannot do this to you," I told her, the tears finally burning the corners of my eyes. "Your father is right about one thing. I have absolutely nothing left to offer you. My parents have taken my money, my home, and my career. If you stay with me, they will target you next. They will drag you into court. They will destroy your reputation. I cannot let you lose your family because of the monsters in mine." "No," Claire cried, grabbing my wrist tightly. "You promised we would survive this together. You promised me last night." I gently pulled my wrist away from her grasp. "I am a sinking ship, Claire. I am completely underwater. You deserve the beautiful life you have always had. You deserve peace. I will walk out that door right now, and I will never let them bother you again. Please, just take the ring off. Stay safe." I turned around to face William. I stood as tall as I possibly could, trying to hold on to the last shred of pride I possessed. "You win, Mr. William," I said quietly. "I am leaving. Keep your daughter safe." I turned my back on the woman I loved and started walking toward the heavy oak doors of the grand foyer. Every step felt like walking through wet cement. I felt completely hollow, completely defeated. My family had successfully erased me from the world. "Harrison, wait." The sound of her voice made me stop dead in my tracks. I turned around slowly. Claire was not crying anymore. She was walking purposefully across the living room, stepping right past her father. She marched straight up to me and grabbed my hand, interlacing her fingers tightly with mine. "What are you doing?" William shouted, his face turning bright red with pure fury. "Claire, step away from him this instant." "I told you the consequences." Claire turned to face her parents. She held her head high, her posture radiating absolute strength. "You think you know the man I love because two malicious strangers handed you a binder full of forged papers," Claire said, her voice ringing clearly through the massive room. "You think money and status dictate who is telling the truth. Harrison has never lied to me. He has never asked me for anything. He was willing to walk away into absolute ruin just to protect me from losing you. That is the kind of man he is." "Claire, do not do this," Victoria begged, standing up from the sofa. "You will have nothing." Claire looked at her mother with deep sadness, then looked back at her furious father. "If you believe their lies over the character of the man standing right in front of you, then I do not want any part of your legacy. Keep your money, Dad. Keep the trust fund. Keep the estate. I am choosing Harrison. I am." William crossed his arms, his eyes turning to stone. "Once you walk out those doors, you are dead to this family. Do not ever try to come back." "We won't," Claire said firmly. She squeezed my hand, turned around and pulled me out the massive front doors. We walked down the stone steps and out into the cold Ohio morning. We got into the cheap rental car and I locked the doors. We sat in the car for a long moment, the silence thick and heavy. She had just surrendered millions of dollars, and her entire family support system simply because she believed in me. We were now completely isolated. We had no family, no money, no home, and a massive legal war waiting for us back in Chicago. Claire turned to me, her chest rising and falling as she processed the magnitude of what she had just done. She looked at me, her eyes filled with trust and determination. "What are we going to do now?" she asked softly. I gripped the steering wheel. The sadness and defeat that had paralyzed me inside the house were completely gone. They had burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. My parents thought I was helpless. Trent thought I was a loser. William thought I was a fraud. They all thought the game was completely over. I looked at Claire, a fierce new energy rushing through my veins. "We go to the firebox," I replied. The drive back toward the outskirts of Chicago took another 6 agonizing hours. I pushed the cheap rental car as fast as the small 4-cylinder engine could possibly handle. The silence between Claire and me was fundamentally different this time. It was no longer the heavy, crushing weight of total defeat that we had felt leaving her parents' estate in Ohio. It was the sharp, highly charged silence of 2 people preparing for a massive war. A war we did not start, but one I was absolutely determined to finish. Claire kept her hand resting gently on my knee the entire journey. Every time I glanced over at her, I felt a profound sense of awe, mixed with a burning, protective rage. She had just given up her family, her massive inheritance, and her entire social safety net for me. She had looked her billionaire father in the eye and walked out the door into total financial uncertainty because she believed in my character. I felt a raging fire igniting deep in my chest. I was not going to let her regret that choice. Not for a single second. I was going to dismantle the people who tried to destroy her future. We pulled off the interstate into a decaying industrial sector located miles away from the gleaming high-rises and pristine suburban country clubs my parents worshipped. This area was a forgotten wasteland of abandoned manufacturing warehouses, cracked concrete lots, and overgrown weeds. I guided the rental car into a rundown self-storage facility enclosed by a leaning, rusting chain-link fence. The automated security gate groaned loudly as I punched in a 6-digit numeric code I had memorized 7 years ago. We drove slowly down a narrow, poorly paved aisle between long rows of faded orange roll-up doors. The freezing rain from the previous night had finally stopped, but the air was still thick with a damp bone-chilling cold and the sharp smell of wet asphalt. I parked the car squarely in front of Unit 412. We stepped out of the vehicle into the freezing wind. The entire facility was completely deserted, giving it the eerie feeling of a concrete graveyard. I walked up to the corrugated metal door and grabbed the heavy steel padlock. It was stiff from years of absolute neglect and exposure to the brutal Chicago winters. The small brass key on my ring fought against the internal tumblers, but it finally turned with a sharp, heavy click. I threw my entire body weight into the bottom handle and pushed the rolling door upward. The metal tracks shrieked in violent protest, echoing loudly across the empty industrial lot. Inside the unit there was no discarded furniture, no boxes of old winter clothes, no nostalgic bins of childhood memories. The space was completely bare concrete, illuminated only by the pale gray light filtering in from the overcast sky outside. There was only one single object sitting squarely in the very center of the floor. It was a heavy industrial steel firebox. The metal was deeply pitted and heavily rusted around the edges, looking like a relic that had survived a century of total neglect. It was incredibly ugly, entirely practical, and completely invisible to anyone who cared only about flashy aesthetic appearances. It was the exact opposite of absolutely everything my wealthy, image-obsessed family valued. Claire stood close beside me, looking down at the rusted box with intense curiosity. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself to ward off the biting wind sweeping into the open unit. "What is this place, Harrison?" she asked, her voice echoing slightly against the bare metal walls. "Why do you have a secret storage unit out here in the middle of nowhere?" I knelt down on the freezing concrete right in front of the firebox. I brushed a thick layer of accumulated gray dust off the heavy reinforced lid. Because I needed a place to bury the absolute truth, I replied, keeping my eyes focused on the rusted steel. I needed a secure place to lock away the dark reality of who my family really is, so I could pretend we were just normal people living normal, functional lives. I honestly thought if I kept this history buried out here, they would eventually learn to love me. I thought my ultimate sacrifice would eventually buy their basic respect. I was completely wrong. I pulled a small secondary security key from my trousers pocket. As I fitted it into the rusted dual lock mechanism, I looked up at Claire. I needed her to understand the entire comprehensive picture before I opened the lid and changed our lives forever. "You heard exactly what my brother Trent told you on the porch last night," I said, my voice steady and completely cold. "You heard him call me a parasite. You heard my father tell your dad that I am a pathetic loser who ruthlessly drained their financial resources. They have told that specific story so many times they actually believe it is the undeniable truth. But they are completely delusional, Claire. They are living inside a fabricated fantasy that I personally paid for." I turned the first key and a heavy mechanical click resonated deep inside the steel box. 7 years ago, Trent was the absolute darling of the Chicago technology scene, I explained slowly. He had the glossy magazine covers, the massive champagne launch parties, and the sprawling penthouse office downtown. My parents were completely intoxicated by his perceived success. They bragged about him endlessly to every single wealthy person at their private country club. But Trent is not a brilliant visionary. He is a reckless narcissist who burns through venture capital just to look important. His entire company was fundamentally hollow. He ran out of operational capital and tried to desperately hide his failure by taking out massive high-interest loans from extremely aggressive private equity lenders. When those massive notes came due, the creditors threatened to liquidate his entire business and press federal charges for corporate financial fraud. Claire listened intently, her eyes wide in the dim, shadowy light of the storage unit. My parents completely panicked. I continued working the stiff second lock. Trent was their golden ticket, their ultimate high society status symbol. If he went to federal prison, their pristine reputation in the wealthy community would be permanently destroyed. So Richard and Patricia quietly mortgaged absolutely everything they owned. They leveraged the massive family estate. They liquidated their robust retirement accounts. They drained every single liquid asset they possessed to cover Trent's massive toxic debt. And it was still not nearly enough. Trent's financial crater was so impossibly deep they were about to lose the house, the luxury cars, and the country club memberships. They were weeks away from absolute total public bankruptcy. I stopped messing with the lock for a moment and looked down at my own hands. My knuckles were white from gripping the cold metal. "And what did you do?" Claire asked softly, kneeling down on the hard concrete right beside me so we were eye to eye. "I did what I always do," I told her. "I fixed the impossible logistical nightmare. I was a junior supply chain manager at the time, but I understood complex financial routing, contract leverage, and asset reallocation better than any of their expensive corporate lawyers. I saw the massive financial collapse coming toward them like a freight train. I knew my parents would end up completely penniless and humiliated on the street. I could not let that happen. Despite absolutely everything, despite how poorly they treated me, how they constantly ignored me, they were still my parents. So I stepped in and did the heavy lifting. I took a deep breath, remembering the sheer stress of those sleepless weeks. I took every single dollar I had ever saved since I was a teenager, working grueling part-time jobs. I liquidated my own modest stock portfolio. But, more importantly, I used my professional industry connections and a flawless credit record to secure a massive commercial line of credit. I built a private independent holding company. I routed the borrowed funds through multiple anonymous corporate layers so the money could never be traced back to a humble junior logistics manager. I executed a total corporate buyout of Trent's toxic debt, and I completely bailed out my parents' severely underwater mortgage. Claire stared at me in absolute shock. The wind outside seemed to vanish entirely, leaving only the sound of our breathing. "You saved them," she whispered, her voice full of profound disbelief. "You saved your brother from federal prison, and you saved your parents from losing their entire empire." I nodded, my jaw tightening at the painful memory. I saved their entire lives. I bought their massive debt and restructured it under a highly restrictive private entity called the Apex Trust. I gave them incredibly generous terms to keep them afloat. But there was a massive psychological problem. My parents are infected with a terminal, incurable case of arrogance and pride. When the anonymous legal paperwork arrived at their mansion, wiping out their imminent debts and saving the estate, they outright refused to believe it came from me. "Why?" Claire asked, shaking her head slowly. "Why would they not want to know their own flesh and blood son saved them from total ruin?" "Because accepting that I saved them would mean openly admitting Trent was a massive, catastrophic failure," I explained bitterly. "It would mean publicly acknowledging that the boring son they treated like a useless peasant was actually the only financially competent man in the entire family." Their fragile egos could not process that humiliating reality. When I went to their house and gently tried to tell my father what I had done, he actually laughed right in my face. He told me to stop taking credit for the work of a brilliant, anonymous Wall Street angel investor who obviously saw the hidden genius in Trent's business model. They literally convinced themselves a benevolent billionaire swooped in to rescue their golden child. They actively erased my massive sacrifice from their reality because acknowledging it would destroy their entire, carefully constructed worldview. I grabbed the heavy metal handle of the rusted firebox. "So I stopped trying to tell them," I said, my voice growing colder and harder by the second. "I let them live in their delusional fantasy. I let them keep their expensive country club memberships and their leased luxury cars. I let them continue treating me like a massive disappointment because I thought taking the high road was the noble thing to do. I quietly managed the Apex Trust from the shadows, keeping their interest rates practically at zero, subsidizing their fake premium lifestyle, while I lived in a modest starter condo and drove a practical sedan. I played the role of the boring, underachieving son because it kept the family peace." I looked down at the heavy metal lid, my eyes narrowing. "But last night they crossed a boundary that can never be uncrossed. They tried to destroy my future with you. They tried to bill me for $900,000 for the basic privilege of being their forgotten child. They illegally froze my bank accounts, got me suspended from my career, and labeled me a dangerous criminal to your parents. They intentionally mistook my quiet silence for weakness and my financial mercy for profound stupidity." I pulled the heavy latch on the firebox. The rusted metal hinges screamed in protest as I threw the heavy lid open. The distinct smell of old archival paper and dry-aged leather drifted up from the dark metal belly of the box. Claire leaned forward, looking inside the container. Sitting perfectly preserved inside the waterproof steel casing was a thick, weathered leather ledger. Resting right on top of the old ledger was a heavy, black, highly encrypted external hard drive. I reached inside and pulled both items out into the cold, gray light. The leather ledger felt heavy and substantial in my hands. It was the absolute, undeniable forensic record of every single financial transaction, every property deed, and every corporate lien I had secretly managed for the last 7 years. "What exactly is on those drives?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a respectful whisper. "The absolute destruction of the Vance family illusion," I replied. "Every wire transfer, every forged document Trent used to secure his original illegal loans. The exact legal formation papers of the Apex Trust, which officially holds the exclusive mortgage to my parents' massive estate, and the total intellectual property rights to Trent's entire technology company." I stood up from the hard concrete floor, holding the weathered ledger and the encrypted drive tightly against my chest. Claire stood up beside me, her eyes locked on the physical artifacts that held the true hidden history of my family. "They think I owe them $900,000. I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any remaining mercy. They think they can crush me into the dirt and take absolutely everything I have built. They do not realize I own the roof over their heads. We left the desolate industrial storage facility and drove through the freezing rain until we found a 24-hour diner glowing like a cheap beacon on the edge of the interstate. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few long-haul transport trucks idling in the dark. We walked inside and slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the far back corner, away from the windows and the sparse late-night crowd. The diner smelled intensely of burnt filter coffee and heavy frying grease. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, constant hum. An older waitress wearing a faded yellow apron walked over and poured us 2 thick ceramic mugs of bitter black coffee without us even having to ask. She left the glass pot on the table and walked away, leaving us completely alone in our exhausted silence. I took a deep breath and placed the weathered leather ledger squarely in the center of the sticky formica table. Right next to it, I carefully set the heavy black encrypted external hard drive. On our drive to the diner, we had stopped at an all-night pawn shop. I used the very last of the emergency cash Claire had in her purse to buy a cheap, refurbished laptop. It was slow and battered, but it was exactly what we needed. I opened the laptop and plugged the encrypted drive into the side port. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across Claire's tired but determined face. A black security prompt appeared on the screen demanding a 32-character alphanumeric passcode. I typed the sequence perfectly from memory. I had not entered that specific code in 7 long years, but my fingers remembered every single keystroke. The security wall dissolved and the master files of the Apex Trust populated the desktop in a series of neatly organized digital folders. Claire wrapped both of her hands tightly around her warm coffee mug, letting the heat seep into her freezing skin. She stared at the blue screen, and then looked down at the physical leather ledger resting on the table. "What exactly are we looking at, Harrison?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were searching my face, trying to understand how a rusted box in a forgotten storage unit was going to save us from total annihilation. "We are looking at the absolute, undeniable financial truth," I replied softly. I opened the heavy cover of the leather ledger. The thick pages crackled as I turned them. I pointed to a column of numbers written in my own careful, methodical handwriting. "I want you to look at these figures, Claire. 7 years ago, my family was completely drowning in over $4 million of extremely toxic debt." Claire leaned closer across the table, her eyes scanning the meticulous rows of financial data. "Trent has always been completely obsessed with the illusion of massive success," I explained, tracing my finger along the dates in the ledger. "He desperately wanted to be seen as a legendary technology founder in Chicago, but his startup company produced absolutely nothing of actual value. He burned through his initial venture capital paying for sprawling penthouse office spaces, lavish launch parties, and aggressive public relations campaigns. When the legitimate money ran dry, Trent panicked. He secretly took out massive, high-interest loans from extremely predatory private equity lenders just to keep his fake empire afloat." I turned the page of the ledger, revealing a series of scanned default notices and aggressive legal threats. "Those private equity sharks do not care about glossy magazine covers," I continued. "When Trent's massive balloon payments inevitably came due, he did not have a single dollar to pay them. The creditors threatened to completely liquidate his entire business and press severe federal charges against him for corporate financial fraud. When my parents found out, they completely lost their minds. Trent was their golden child, their ultimate high society status symbol. If he went to federal prison, their pristine reputation at the country club would be permanently destroyed. They would become a complete laughingstock." Claire shook her head slowly, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. "But your parents have millions," she noted. "They live in a massive estate. They drive imported luxury cars. Surely they could have just paid off his debts and bailed him out themselves." "That is exactly the illusion they project to the world," I said, taking a sip of the bitter black coffee. "The truth is, their wealth has always been heavily leveraged. To save Trent from federal prison, Richard and Patricia quietly mortgaged absolutely everything they owned. They leveraged the massive family estate to the absolute limit. They quietly liquidated their robust retirement accounts. They drained every single liquid asset they possessed and poured it into Trent's sinking ship. And it was still not nearly enough. Trent's financial crater was so impossibly deep they were all going to go down together. They were weeks away from total public bankruptcy. They were going to lose the mansion, the cars, and their entire social standing. I paused, feeling the ghost of that old familiar exhaustion settling into my bones. I remembered the sleepless nights, the sheer panic, and the frantic mathematical calculations I ran in my cramped apartment while my family prepared to lose everything. "And what did you do?" Claire asked, her voice filled with a profound and quiet awe. "I did what I always do," I told her, looking directly into her beautiful eyes. "I fixed the impossible logistical nightmare. I was just a junior supply chain manager at the time, but I understood complex financial routing, contract leverage, and asset reallocation better than any of their expensive corporate lawyers. I saw the massive financial collapse coming toward them like a runaway freight train. I knew my parents would end up completely penniless and humiliated on the street. I could not let that happen. Despite absolutely everything they had done to me, despite how poorly they treated me, how they constantly ignored me and belittled me, they were still my parents. So I stepped in and did the heavy lifting. I turned the laptop screen so Claire could see the main directory of the external drive. I opened a folder labeled Apex Trust Formation Documents. I took every single dollar I had ever saved since I was a teenager working grueling part-time jobs, I explained. I liquidated my own modest stock portfolio. But more importantly, I used my professional industry connections and a flawless, pristine credit record to secure a massive commercial line of credit. I built a private, independent holding company called the Apex Trust. I routed the borrowed funds through multiple anonymous corporate layers, so the money could never be legally traced back to a humble junior logistics manager. I executed a total corporate buyout of Trent's toxic debt, and I completely bailed out my parents' severely underwater mortgage. Claire stared at me in absolute shock. The noisy hum of the diner seemed to fade away entirely. "You saved them," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You saved your brother from going to federal prison, and you saved your parents from losing their entire empire. You did all of that for them." I nodded, my jaw tightening at the painful memory of their ultimate betrayal. "I saved their entire lives, Claire. I bought their massive debt and restructured it under this highly restrictive private entity. I gave them incredibly generous terms to keep them afloat. But there was a massive psychological problem. My parents are infected with a terminal, incurable case of arrogance and pride. When the anonymous legal paperwork arrived at their mansion, wiping out their imminent debts and saving the estate, they outright refused to believe it came from me." "Why?" Claire asked, her voice laced with sudden anger. "Why would they not want to know their own flesh and blood son saved them from total ruin?" "Because accepting that I saved them would mean openly admitting Trent was a massive, catastrophic failure," I explained bitterly. "It would mean publicly acknowledging that the boring, underachieving son they treated like a useless peasant was actually the only financially competent man in the entire family. Their fragile egos simply could not process that humiliating reality. When I went to their house and gently tried to tell my father what I had done, he actually laughed right in my face. He told me to stop taking credit for the work of a brilliant anonymous Wall Street angel investor who obviously saw the hidden genius in Trent's business model. They literally convinced themselves a benevolent billionaire swooped in to rescue their golden child. They actively erased my massive sacrifice from their reality because acknowledging it would destroy their entire carefully constructed worldview." I grabbed the heavy metal edge of the laptop. "So I stopped trying to tell them the truth," I said, my voice growing colder and harder by the second. "I let them live in their delusional fantasy. I let them keep their expensive country club memberships and their leased luxury cars. I quietly managed the Apex Trust from the shadows, keeping their interest rates practically at zero, subsidizing their fake premium lifestyle, while I lived in a modest starter condo and drove a practical sedan. I played the role of the boring, underachieving son because it kept the family peace. I clicked on a subfolder labeled Collateral and Deeds. But when you buy toxic debt, you require absolute collateral. I continued tapping the screen. I did not just pay off their loans out of the goodness of my heart. I legally absorbed their collateral to protect my investment. I pulled up a scanned property deed for my parents' sprawling 6-bedroom mansion in the prestigious Chicago suburbs. Look at this document, Claire. The Apex Trust holds the exclusive first position mortgage on their estate. They do not own that house. The trust owns it. They have been living there under a 0% interest grace period that I personally authorized every single year. Claire scanned the legal jargon on the screen, her eyes moving rapidly across the text. So the trust literally owns the roof over their heads, she asked. She, I nodded firmly. Yes, and Trent is even worse, I told her, pulling up a different contract. Trent's technology company has absolutely zero hard assets. The only thing of value his startup ever produced was a proprietary software algorithm. When the Apex Trust bailed out his failing company, the trust took absolute ownership of all his intellectual property. Every single line of code his company uses to operate is legally leased to him by the Apex Trust. If the trust revokes that software license, his entire tech empire evaporates overnight. He would have nothing but empty office space and a massive pile of useless computers. Claire sat back against the cracked vinyl of the booth. She looked at the laptop screen, and then she looked deeply into my eyes. The sheer magnitude of the power I held was finally sinking in. You own them, she whispered, a quiet laugh of pure astonishment escaping her lips. You literally own everything they use to pretend they are superior to the rest of the world, and they have absolutely no idea it is you. They have no idea, I confirmed slowly. They refuse to read the actual formation documents. If they had bothered to look past their own arrogance, they would have seen my digital signature buried deep in the operating agreement. They thought they were cornering a helpless logistics manager yesterday. They thought they could strip me of my dignity, my job, and my future wife without any consequences. I opened the back cover of the heavy leather ledger and pulled out a single piece of heavy parchment paper, covered in dense legal text. I slid it across the sticky table toward Claire. But here is the absolute masterstroke, I said, leaning forward, so my voice carried only to her. I knew exactly who my family was. I knew they were greedy, toxic, and completely incapable of basic gratitude. I knew that eventually their arrogant behavior would become a massive liability. So, when I had my private attorney draft the bailout contract 7 years ago, I insisted on including a very specific legal provision just in case they ever tried to turn their venom on me. Read Section 4, Paragraph B. I instructed her, tapping the heavy paper. Claire picked up the document and squinted at the fine print. It is called the Morality and Default Clause, she read aloud. She paused, her eyes widening as she scanned the heavy, complex legal jargon. What exactly does this mean, Harrison? I smiled a cold, hard smile. It means that the 0% interest rate and the extended financial grace period are entirely conditional, I explained, translating the contract into plain English. The beneficiaries of the trust, meaning Richard, Patricia, and Trent, are strictly forbidden from initiating any hostile legal action, financial extortion, or fraudulent claims against the sole manager of the Apex Trust. I tapped my finger firmly on the table for emphasis. If they ever violate that specific clause, I continued, every single protective measure immediately evaporates. The grace period is permanently canceled. The original aggressive high interest rates from their predatory private equity lenders are instantly and retroactively applied to the entire principal balance, and the total compounded sum of the massive debt becomes due in full within 24 hours. If they fail to pay the total balance, the trust has the immediate automatic right to seize all collateral. That means the trust takes the mansion and the trust takes Trent's entire company. Claire covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes were incredibly bright, reflecting a sudden, fierce, and beautiful joy. "Harrison," she whispered, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "Yesterday they served you with a formal civil lawsuit. They accused you of severe financial fraud and elder abuse. They handed my father a fabricated dossier trying to extort us for $900,000. I nodded, my heart pounding with a steady, powerful rhythm. "Exactly," I said. "By officially suing me and trying to extort me for the cost of raising me, they legally attacked the sole manager of the Apex Trust. They just triggered the morality and default clause of their own multi-million-dollar bailout. They documented their own demise and filed it directly with the county court. They thought they were building a perfect trap to destroy my life. They did not realize they were actively trying to extort the very entity that literally owns their entire existence." Just as the profound reality of my words settled over the table, the cheap burner phone we had purchased at a gas station suddenly buzzed violently against the formica. I had transferred my old SIM card into the temporary device just in case there were emergency calls from my workplace. I picked up the small plastic phone and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Trent. I read the message out loud so Claire could hear it. "Trent says mediation tomorrow at noon. Bring a certified check for the full amount, or we take this criminal investigation public to all your corporate clients. Do not test us, little brother." I looked up from the glowing screen and looked at my future wife. I smiled for the very first time in days. The deep, crushing anxiety that had suffocated me for the last 24 hours was completely gone. I felt incredibly light. I felt absolutely dangerous. Claire smiled back at me, squeezing my hand across the table. Her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She was ready for war. "They want a mediation," I said softly, closing the heavy leather cover of the 7-year ledger. "They want a check. Tomorrow at noon, we are going to give them exactly what they asked for. We are going to walk into that room and let them sign their own execution orders." The prey had just proudly invited the hunter directly into the trap. We did not go to a towering glass skyscraper in downtown Chicago to find our legal counsel. We drove our cheap rented compact car to a faded strip mall in a working-class neighborhood miles away from the city center. We walked into a small, cramped office that smelled like old paper and cheap coffee. The sign on the frosted glass door simply read, "David Miller, Attorney at Law." David was an older man with tired eyes and a slightly wrinkled suit. He charged $200 an hour, which we paid using the absolute last of Claire's emergency credit line. He looked exactly like the kind of desperate, low-tier lawyer my arrogant family would expect a ruined man to hire. That was precisely why I chose him. I did not want to intimidate my parents. I wanted them to feel absolutely invincible. We sat in the uncomfortable plastic chairs across from David's cluttered desk. I unzipped my leather briefcase and placed the heavy, rusted ledger and the printed documents from the encrypted drive onto the cheap wood veneer. I explained to David that my parents had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable assets. I told him how they had built a fortress of lies around my brother Trent, completely ignoring the catastrophic reality of his business failures. David listened quietly, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. He was a man who had clearly seen the worst side of human nature during his decades practicing law, but even he seemed genuinely appalled by the sheer scale of my parents' malicious extortion. He told me that in his 30 years of practice, he had never seen a family actively try to destroy their own flesh and blood with such calculated surgical precision. I told him they did not view me as a son. They viewed me as an unpaid debt. I watched David's eyes scan the dense legal jargon of the Apex Trust formation papers. I watched his expression shift from polite boredom to absolute stunned disbelief. He looked up at me, taking off his reading glasses. His hands were actually shaking. He asked me if these documents were completely authenticated. I told him they were ironclad and legally binding. I showed him the morality and default clause. I explained the exact terms of the financial trap I had built 7 years ago. David reviewed the morality and default clause one more time, running his pen under the specific legal stipulations. He told me the contract was a masterpiece of defensive jurisprudence. He said the clause was triggered not just by a successful lawsuit, but by the mere initiation of any hostile legal action or extortion attempt against the manager of the Apex Trust. David leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, slow breath. He told me that my family was walking blindly into a legal wood chipper. He said if they tried to enforce their fake $900,000 invoice, they would instantly trigger the default on their own estate. I told David that was exactly the plan, but we needed to make sure the trap snapped shut completely. I laid out the strategy. We could not walk into the mediation room and simply slap the ledger on the table. If my father saw my real power, he would use his expensive corporate lawyers to delay, deflect, and tie the trust up in endless litigation. We needed him to sign a formal legal document on the record actively attempting to extort me. We needed his own greed to close the cage permanently. David agreed completely. He told me I had to play the role of the broken, defeated son perfectly. I had to let them think they had completely destroyed me. I had to let them smell blood in the water. I had to make them feel so powerful that they would sign anything without reading the fine print. The mediation was scheduled for exactly noon the next day. The location was a massive, prestigious corporate law firm located on the 50th floor of a downtown high-rise. Claire and I arrived 30 minutes early. I parked our cheap rental car in the sprawling underground parking garage. My suit was still slightly damp and terribly wrinkled from the day before. I had not slept a single minute. I looked completely exhausted and entirely beaten down. It was not entirely an act. The emotional toll of my family's betrayal was a heavy physical weight dragging down my shoulders. But beneath that exhaustion, the cold, calculating fury was keeping me perfectly focused. We stepped out of the rental car just as a brand new, flawless white Tesla glided silently into the executive parking space right next to us. The doors lifted slowly and my brother Trent stepped out. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit and a pair of expensive designer sunglasses. He looked like a man who had just conquered the entire world. Trent was not just satisfied with mocking my rental car. He walked slowly around the cheap, compact vehicle, dragging his hand lightly along the hood as if he were inspecting a piece of garbage. He told me it was incredibly fitting that I was finally driving a car that matched my actual social value. He bragged about how his new Tesla was fully loaded and how his company had just secured another round of phantom funding to expand their downtown offices. I knew for a fact that his company was bleeding cash every single month and that the Apex Trust was the only thing keeping his servers running, but I did not say a word. I let him bask in his fabricated glory. He slowly walked over to us, his leather shoes echoing sharply against the concrete floor of the garage. He stopped a few feet away, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. He told me I looked absolutely pathetic. He asked if I had enjoyed sleeping in the gutter like a stray dog. I kept my head down, playing the role David and I had rehearsed. I let my shoulders slump heavily. I did not meet his eyes. I told him I just wanted this nightmare to be over. Trent smiled a wide, predatory smile. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a mocking whisper. He told me he was actually here to do me a massive favor. He said Mom and Dad were furious, but he had convinced them to offer me a generous deal. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He told me it was a formal confession of debt. All I had to do was sign it. If I signed the document legally admitting that I owed them $900,000 and confessing to the fabricated corporate fraud, they would drop the criminal charges. He said they would call my human resources department and withdraw the elder abuse complaints. They would let me keep my miserable little life as long as they owned my future paychecks. Trent leaned in closer, tapping the paper against my chest. He told me it was the only way I was going to avoid federal prison. He told me to swallow my pride, admit I was a complete failure, and sign my life away to the family. I looked up at him, forcing my voice to tremble slightly. I asked him why he was doing this to me after everything I had done for him. Trent laughed a cold, hollow sound. He told me I had never done anything for anyone but myself. He told me I was a parasite and it was time to pay my tab. He turned around and walked toward the private executive elevator, leaving Claire and me standing in the cold, damp garage. Claire squeezed my hand tightly. I looked at her and gave her a very small, imperceptible nod. Trent had taken the bait perfectly. We rode the elevator up to the 50th floor. The doors opened into a breathtaking lobby with imported marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city of Chicago. We were escorted by a polite receptionist into a massive glass-walled conference room. Richard and Patricia were already sitting on one side of the long, polished mahogany table. They were flanked by 3 incredibly expensive corporate attorneys wearing immaculate suits. My parents looked like royalty holding court. Patricia was sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass, looking at us with absolute disdain. Richard sat perfectly straight, his hands folded neatly on the table, projecting an aura of total invincibility. David, my modest $200 an hour lawyer, walked in, a moment later, carrying a scuffed leather briefcase. He sat down next to me, looking incredibly out of place in the opulent room. The lead attorney for my parents, a man named Sterling, opened the proceedings. He did not waste any time. He slapped a thick stack of legal documents onto the center of the table. He stated in a loud, aggressive voice that they were here to collect a legally binding debt of $900,000. He said they had overwhelming evidence of my financial crimes, and that they were fully prepared to hand the entire dossier over to the district attorney by 3 o'clock this afternoon if we did not reach an absolute surrender. I let out a long, shaky breath. I slumped down in my heavy leather chair. I looked across the table at my father. I forced my eyes to well up with tears. I let my voice crack perfectly. I begged him to stop. I told him he had already taken my home, my money, and my career. I told him I was completely ruined. I pleaded with him to drop the fake criminal charges so I could at least try to find a minimum wage job to survive. I looked at my mother and asked her how she could do this to her own son. Patricia could not resist twisting the knife while I sat there pretending to be completely broken. She leaned across the polished table, her diamond jewelry catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. She told me that I had always been a massive disappointment to her. She said she had spent years trying to mold me into someone respectable, someone who could stand proudly beside Trent at high society events. But she claimed I was born with a mediocre mind and a lazy spirit. She told Claire that I was a lost cause and that I had dragged their family name through the mud for the very last time. Her voice was dripping with fake sympathy, perfectly calibrated to make her look like the tragic victim of a terrible, ungrateful son. Richard nodded in agreement, placing a comforting hand over Patricia's. He told the room that this was the hardest thing a father ever had to do, but that tough love was the only way to teach a parasite how to survive in the real world. Their expensive lawyers sat there nodding solemnly, completely oblivious to the fact that their wealthy clients were currently sitting in a building they did not actually own, funded by money they did not actually have. I let my shoulders shake harder, producing a few fake tears that spilled over my hands. I told them I would sign whatever they wanted me to sign. I told them I would give them a portion of every paycheck I ever earned for the rest of my life. But I begged them with genuine-sounding desperation to please leave Claire entirely out of this. I told them she had nothing to do with my failures, and that her family did not deserve to be dragged into this mess. I pleaded that they focus their anger solely on me and let her walk away untainted by our family drama. I kept my head bowed, letting my shoulders shake as if I was weeping uncontrollably. The moment I begged them to spare Claire, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. I watched my father's eyes narrow through the gaps in my fingers. I watched the greed suddenly ignite in his pupils like a match striking dry wood. He looked at my slumped, defeated posture, and then he looked directly at Claire, who was sitting quietly beside me holding my arm. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. He smiled a slow, terrifying smile. He did not just want my future wages anymore. He realized that a ruined, disgraced logistics manager would take decades to pay back $900,000. But sitting right across from him was the only daughter of an Ohio manufacturing billionaire. He smelled blood in the water. He saw an opportunity to extract massive, immediate wealth. Richard raised his hand, silencing his own expensive lawyers. He looked at Claire, and his voice dropped into a smooth, calculating tone. He told her that my future wages were simply not good enough collateral for a debt of this magnitude. He said that if she truly loved me and wanted to save me from spending the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary, she needed to prove it right here and right now. Richard demanded that Claire use her status as a beneficiary of her wealthy family to officially underwrite my debt. He demanded that her family trust be legally listed as the absolute guarantor of the $900,000 invoice. He wanted her signature on a binding legal contract tying all of her family assets directly to my fabricated crimes under one single legal jurisdiction. He pushed a shiny silver pen across the table toward her. He told her she had to sign the paper today tying our financial destinies together, or he would make the phone call to the district attorney and have me arrested before we even reached the parking garage. He wanted her family to bleed just as much as he wanted me to bleed. He wanted absolute total financial domination. I kept my face buried in my hands so they could not see my expression. I was not crying. I was smiling. The prey had just stepped directly onto the landmine. The air inside the 50th floor conference room felt incredibly thin and entirely toxic. I kept my face buried in my hands for a few more seconds, letting the profound silence stretch out and fill every corner of the massive glass-walled space. My father, Richard, sat directly across from me, radiating an aura of total absolute dominance. He had played his cards perfectly in his own mind. He had successfully cornered his disappointment of a son and was now actively targeting the vast wealth of my fiancée's family. I slowly lowered my hands and looked up at him, letting my eyes portray nothing but pure exhaustion and total defeat. Sterling, the lead corporate attorney sitting to my father's right, leaned forward. He possessed the sleek, polished look of a man who made thousands of dollars an hour ruining people's lives. He placed a heavy stack of pristine legal documents squarely in the center of the mahogany table. He placed his perfectly manicured hand on top of the stack and slowly pushed it across the smooth wood until it rested right in front of me. Sterling explained the terms of my surrender with a slow, deliberate cadence. He wanted to make sure I understood the absolute severity of my situation. He said the paperwork was an unconditional confession of debt and a formal admission of severe financial misconduct against my own parents. He told me that by signing the document, I was legally agreeing to garnish 50% of all my future earnings for the rest of my natural life until the fabricated $900,000 debt was paid in full. But more importantly, he pointed his expensive silver pen directly at Claire. He stated that the contract included a binding clause making her family trust the ultimate guarantor of the debt. If I failed to make a payment, the courts would immediately seize the funds directly from her father's industrial empire. They wanted to make sure I could never escape their control. They wanted to own my future, and they wanted to own the family I was marrying into. I looked down at the thick stack of papers. My hands were shaking. I did not have to fake the physical tremor in my fingers. The sheer amount of adrenaline pumping through my heart was making my entire body vibrate. I was sitting mere inches away from executing the most devastating financial trap my family had ever seen. I looked at Trent. My older brother was leaning back in his plush leather chair, inspecting his fingernails with profound boredom. He caught me looking at him and offered a small, vicious smile. He told me to just sign the papers so he could go enjoy a late lunch. He said I was wasting the valuable time of very important people. He reminded me of our conversation in the parking garage before we came upstairs. He said I should be grateful they were offering me a deal instead of letting me rot in a federal prison cell. He was so completely certain of his own victory that he could not even bother to sit up straight. I looked at my mother and asked her how she could do this to her own son. Patricia could not resist twisting the knife while I sat there pretending to be completely broken. She leaned across the polished table, her diamond jewelry catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. She told me that I had always been a massive disappointment to her. She said she had spent years trying to mold me into someone respectable, someone who could stand proudly beside Trent at high society events. But she claimed I was born with a mediocre mind and a lazy spirit. She told Claire that I was a lost cause and that I had dragged their family name through the mud for the very last time. Her voice was dripping with fake sympathy, perfectly calibrated to make her look like the tragic victim of a terrible, ungrateful son. Richard nodded in agreement, placing a comforting hand over Patricia's. He told the room that this was the hardest thing a father ever had to do, but that tough love was the only way to teach a parasite how to survive in the real world. Their expensive lawyers sat there, nodding solemnly, completely oblivious to the fact that their wealthy clients were currently sitting in a building they did not actually own, funded by money they did not actually have. I let my shoulders shake harder, producing a few fake tears that spilled over my hands. I told them I would sign whatever they wanted me to sign. I told them I would give them a portion of every paycheck I ever earned for the rest of my life. But I begged them with genuine-sounding desperation to please leave Claire entirely out of this. I told them she had nothing to do with my failures and that her family did not deserve to be dragged into this mess. I pleaded that they focus their anger solely on me and let her walk away untainted by our family drama. I kept my head bowed, letting my shoulders shake as if I was weeping uncontrollably. The moment I begged them to spare Claire, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted exactly as my lawyer David had predicted. I watched my father's eyes narrow through the gaps in my fingers. I watched the greed suddenly ignite in his pupils like a match striking dry wood. He looked at my slumped, defeated posture, and then he looked directly at Claire, who was sitting quietly beside me, holding my arm. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. He smiled, a slow, terrifying smile. He did not just want my future wages anymore. He realized that a ruined, disgraced logistics manager would take decades to pay back $900,000. But sitting right across from him was the only daughter of an Ohio manufacturing billionaire. He smelled blood in the water. He saw an opportunity to extract massive, immediate wealth. Richard raised his hand, silencing his own expensive lawyers. He looked at Claire and his voice dropped into a smooth, calculating tone. He told her that my future wages were simply not good enough collateral for a debt of this magnitude. He said that if she truly loved me and wanted to save me from spending the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary, she needed to prove it right here and right now. Richard demanded that Claire use her status as a beneficiary of her wealthy family to officially underwrite my debt. He demanded that her family trust be legally listed as the absolute guarantor of the $900,000 invoice. He wanted her signature on a binding legal contract tying all of her family assets directly to my fabricated crimes under one single legal jurisdiction. He pushed a shiny silver pen across the table toward her. He told her she had to sign the paper today tying our financial destinies together, or he would make the phone call to the district attorney and have me arrested before we even reached the parking garage. He wanted her family to bleed just as much as he wanted me to bleed. He wanted absolute total financial domination. I looked at David, my modest $200 an hour attorney. David was brilliant. He played the role of the intimidated low-tier lawyer with absolute perfection. He nervously cleared his throat and adjusted his wrinkled suit jacket. He stammered slightly as he spoke, addressing the row of high-powered attorneys across the table. He said his client was prepared to sign the full confession and accept the total financial burden. He said we completely understood that we had absolutely no leverage left in this situation. He stated that Claire was willing to bind her family trust to the agreement to save my freedom. My mother, Patricia, let out a quiet scoff of satisfaction. She whispered to Richard that it was about time I finally learned my place in the world. David opened his scuffed briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table toward Sterling. He said we only had one minor procedural request before we finalized the total surrender. He explained that Claire's family was incredibly private and deeply concerned about their public reputation. He said her father, William, utilized a highly confidential private entity to manage his daughter's financial affairs. Therefore, we requested that one standard boilerplate addendum be attached to the final agreement, just to protect her family's privacy from public court records. Sterling picked up the single sheet of paper with an expression of intense irritation. He asked what the addendum stated. I spoke up for the first time since the documents were presented. I kept my voice quiet and completely submissive. I told them the addendum simply stated that all parties acknowledge that this document supersedes any previous anonymous debts held by the Apex Trust. I watched my father's face carefully. I watched Trent's eyes. I waited to see if the name Apex Trust would trigger any sense of panic or recognition in their minds. But they were completely blinded by their own massive egos. Richard rolled his eyes and let out a heavy sigh of annoyance. He assumed immediately that the Apex Trust was simply a sophisticated shell company set up by Claire's billionaire father to hide his money from the government. Trent actually laughed out loud. He told me it was pathetic that I was hiding behind my fiancée's trust fund just to save my own skin. He said he did not care what fake corporate name her family used as long as the check cleared the bank by Monday morning. They were so consumed by their own victory that they did not even consider the possibility that I was the one holding the cards. I looked at Sterling. He was a partner at a massive law firm. He was supposed to be a master of due diligence. But he was sitting in a room with a seemingly broken man and a cheap strip mall lawyer. He felt absolutely no threat. He barely even scanned the single paragraph on the page. He simply saw a terrified son trying to shield his wealthy future in-laws from public embarrassment. Sterling tossed the paper back onto the table. He told my father it was standard indemnification language for high-net-worth family trusts. He said it was completely harmless and actually solidified their ability to collect the $900,000 directly from the trust fund. He told Richard that signing the addendum was the fastest way to secure the money. Richard leaned forward, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated greed. He did not care about the legal language. He only cared about the massive payout he was about to receive. He saw $900,000 of clean liquid cash floating right in front of him. He saw the ultimate victory over the son he despised. He wanted the money to fund his extravagant country club lifestyle, and he wanted the absolute joy of knowing he had finally broken my spirit permanently. He told Sterling to attach the addendum immediately and finalize the signatures. He told me I was out of time and out of options. He demanded that we finish the paperwork so he could get back to his important life. Sterling stapled the single sheet of paper to the back of the massive extortion document. He handed the expensive silver pen to my father. Richard did not hesitate for a single second. He signed his name with a bold, aggressive flourish on the primary plaintiff line. He slid the document over to Trent. My brother grabbed the pen and signed his name right below my father's, adding his corporate title to make himself feel important. Patricia signed next, her signature sharp and elegant. Sterling applied his legal seal and his own signature, acting as the official witness to the agreement. They were all completely eager to lock me into a lifetime of financial slavery. They had no idea they were actively signing away their entire empire. Sterling pushed the entire packet across the wide mahogany table until it rested directly in front of me. He told me to sign the bottom of the last page and initial the addendum. I picked up the heavy silver pen. The metal felt cold against my skin. I looked at Claire. She was sitting perfectly still, her breathing slow and steady. She had known the plan from the very beginning, but watching it unfold in real time was still terrifying. She gave me a single, confident nod. I looked down at the paper. I pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line and signed my full legal name. I flipped to the back page and initialed the addendum, permanently locking the morality and default clause into active legal effect. I handed the pen to Claire, and she signed her name beside mine, acting as the final guarantor. I placed the silver pen down on the polished wood. The soft click of the metal hitting the table sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. The ink was completely dry. My parents had officially and legally documented their malicious attempt to extort me. They had tied their entire financial existence to the specific addendum we provided. I took a deep breath, letting the heavy, suffocating facade of the broken, defeated sun fall away entirely. I slowly sat up straight in my leather chair, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin. The dramatic shift in my physical posture was so immediate and so jarring that Trent actually stopped smiling. Richard frowned deeply, suddenly sensing that the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. I reached forward and slowly slid the signed, legally binding extortion papers into my own briefcase, snapping the lock shut. Then I reached back into the briefcase. I pulled out the heavy, rusted 7-year leather ledger and placed it squarely onto the center of the mahogany table. I placed the heavy, rusted 7-year ledger squarely onto the center of the polished mahogany table. The dull thud of the weathered leather hitting the expensive wood seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the massive conference room. I did not slump my shoulders anymore. I sat perfectly straight in my chair and pulled my chest high. The terrified trembling in my hands vanished completely. The broken, defeated son they thought they were legally executing was gone. I looked across the table at my family. The atmosphere in the room changed so violently and so rapidly that the 3 expensive corporate attorneys instantly stiffened in their seats. Richard frowned deeply. He looked at the old scuffed book and then looked back up at me with an expression of pure irritation. He demanded to know what kind of garbage I was putting on the table. He told me the negotiation was completely over and instructed me to hand the finalized paperwork to his lead attorney Sterling so they could leave. I did not move. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father. "We are not finished, Richard," I said. My voice was completely different now. The desperate, frantic tone was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, mechanical authority. I sounded exactly like a senior logistics executive executing a hostile corporate takeover. "We are just getting to the absolute bottom line." I opened the heavy cover of the rusted ledger. The dry pages crackled loudly in the dead silence of the room. I reached into the interior pocket of the binder and pulled out a thick stack of original, unredacted legal documents. The heavy parchment paper bore the official embossed gold seals of the State Financial Registry. I did not hand them to my father. I slid them directly across the smooth mahogany table toward Sterling. "I want you to read those formation documents very carefully, Sterling," I instructed him, my tone dropping to an ice-cold register. "Read the primary beneficiary listings. Read the unredacted managerial assignments and the exact corporate structure of the Apex Trust." Sterling let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, clearly performing for his wealthy clients. He picked up the documents, adjusting his designer glasses, assuming this was just some desperate last-minute plea for mercy from a ruined man. He flipped casually to the first page. I sat back in my chair and watched his eyes scan the dense legal paragraphs. I watched the exact second his highly trained legal mind processed the catastrophic reality of what he was holding. It was a visible physical transformation. The arrogant color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His breathing stopped entirely. The hand holding the documents began to tremble so violently that the thick parchment paper rustled audibly in the quiet room. Sterling flipped frantically to the second page and then the third, his eyes darting back and forth across the undeniable forensic proof. He realized in a matter of seconds that he had just allowed his clients to sign a fatal binding extortion agreement against the single most powerful financial entity in their lives. He realized he had just walked his clients directly into a financial wood chipper. "What is it?" "Sterling." Richard snapped, clearly annoyed by his lawyer's sudden, terrifying silence. "Stop wasting time and put those papers away." Sterling slowly lowered the documents to the table. He took off his glasses with shaking fingers. He turned his head slowly to look at my father. He looked like a man who had just watched a skyscraper collapse. Richard Sterling whispered, his voice completely stripped of its former confidence and replaced by pure absolute dread. "He owns it. He owns all of it. Owns. What are you talking about? Trent spat, leaning forward abruptly and snatching the documents right out of Sterling's trembling hands. Trent looked down at the paperwork. His eyes scanned the text until they hit the bold printed letters identifying my full legal name as the sole absolute manager and primary controller of the Apex Trust. Trent's jaw dropped open. "This is a forgery!" Trent yelled, throwing the papers back onto the table in a panic. "This is absolute garbage. You expect us to believe that you are the anonymous Wall Street angel investor who bailed us out 7 years ago. You are a freight manager, Harrison. You move boxes for a living. You do not have this kind of capital." I looked directly at my older brother. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone perfectly level and surgically precise. I did not have the capital. "Trent," I explained slowly, treating him like a slow child, "but I had a pristine credit score, flawless corporate industry connections, and a logistical mind capable of understanding complex financial structures that you were too incredibly arrogant to ever study. 7 years ago, when your fake technology startup was weeks away from complete and total liquidation, you were drowning in over $4 million of toxic debt from predatory private equity lenders. You were facing federal prison for severe corporate financial fraud." Trent's face flushed a deep, angry red, but he could not find a single word to say. He knew I was telling the exact truth. "I bought your debt." "Trent," I said, the words cutting through the room like a knife. "I created the Apex Trust, and I purchased every single toxic loan you possessed from those private equity sharks. I bailed you out, but I did not do it out of the goodness of my heart. As the sole manager of the Apex Trust, I took absolute legal ownership of your entire company as collateral to protect my investment. You do not own your tech startup, Trent. You never did. The Apex Trust owns every single computer, every single desk, and every single line of proprietary software code your business uses to operate. I lease your own software back to you on a monthly basis. I have been letting you play the role of a successful tech founder for 7 years, because I honestly pitied you." Trent sank slowly back into his plush leather chair, looking as if he had been physically struck in the chest. His flashy, confident facade completely shattered, leaving nothing but a terrified fraud sitting in an expensive suit. I turned my gaze away from my brother and focused entirely on my parents. Richard and Patricia were staring at me in total horrified silence. They were finally beginning to understand the massive, catastrophic magnitude of their mistake. "And then there is the matter of your estate," I said, looking directly into my father's wide, panicked eyes. "When Trent's fake empire collapsed 7 years ago, it threatened to take your pristine high society lifestyle down with it. You secretly leveraged your massive suburban mansion to the absolute breaking point just to keep him afloat. You completely drained your retirement accounts. You were totally bankrupt, Richard. You were weeks away from having your country club memberships revoked and being thrown out onto the street by the banks." Patricia covered her mouth with her trembling hand, letting out a quiet, muffled gasp of pure horror. She looked around the room, terrified that the expensive lawyers were hearing the deeply buried truth about her fake wealth. "The Apex Trust bought your defaulted mortgage," I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly against the glass walls of the conference room. "I am the entity that holds the exclusive deed to your house. I am the one who authorized a 0% interest grace period for the last 7 years, so you would not be evicted. I actively subsidized your imported luxury cars, your country club memberships, and your extravagant vacations. I allowed you to believe a magical billionaire saved you because I knew your fragile narcissistic egos could never handle the absolute truth. You were too proud to ever admit that the son you relentlessly abused and neglected was the only reason you were not currently sleeping in a homeless shelter." I paused for a moment, letting the devastating reality settle over the long mahogany table. The only sound in the room was the heavy rain beating against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I reached over and tapped the black leather extortion binder my father had presented to me at the engagement dinner. "You sat in a restaurant yesterday and handed my fiancée a bill for $900,000, I said, a cold, dark laugh escaping my lips. "You had the absolute audacity to claim I was a financial burden to you. That number is pathetic. It is completely laughable compared to the actual math. I opened the rusted ledger and pointed to the exact forensic accounting records. Trent's Holotech company officially owes the Apex Trust $2.4 million in back-funded loans, I stated clearly, mapping out their financial doom. Your personal residential estate has been in technical default for 3 consecutive years, entirely paused by my own personal generosity. The total compounded debt you collectively owe the Apex Trust is currently north of $6 million. And I was completely willing to forgive all of it. I was perfectly willing to let you live in your comfortable illusion forever, while I lived my own quiet life. I looked down at the freshly signed documents resting securely inside my open briefcase. But you could not just leave me alone, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, aggressive whisper. You had to illegally freeze my bank accounts. You had to destroy my corporate career. You had to hire a locksmith to physically lock me out of my own home in the freezing rain. You had to go to Ohio and try to ruin my future wife by feeding her family fabricated police reports. You forced my hand. I looked back up at Richard. The man who had terrorized me my entire life, the man who had treated me like a worthless peasant, was suddenly looking very small and incredibly old. His face was covered in a cold sweat. You should have read the fine print of the original Apex Trust formation documents, Richard I told him, leaning slightly forward in my chair. You should have hired a competent lawyer to review the bailout contracts 7 years ago instead of just blindly accepting the free money to save your reputation. If you had bothered to do even basic due diligence, you would have noticed a very specific legal stipulation buried in the covenants. It is known as the Morality and Default Clause. Sterling, the expensive attorney, buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, agonizing groan of absolute professional defeat. He knew exactly what was coming next. The Morality and Default Clause strictly forbids any beneficiary of the trust from initiating any hostile legal action, extortion, or fraudulent civil claims against the manager of the trust. I explained clearly and methodically, making sure every single person in the room understood the exact mechanics of their destruction. If that clause is ever violated, every single protective measure immediately evaporates. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the newly signed extortion addendum, the paper that Claire and I had insisted on adding just moments ago. I held it up so the harsh fluorescent lights illuminated their fresh ink signatures. 5 minutes ago, you forced Claire and me to sign this formal extortion document, I said, tapping the paper. You officially sued me in a court of law. You officially attempted to extort me for $900,000 on the public record. By placing your signatures on this legal agreement, you actively and undeniably attacked the sole manager of the Apex Trust. Patricia began to openly weep, her composure completely shattered. Trent stared at the table, his eyes wide and vacant, unable to process that his life was completely over. You just legally triggered the default clause, I stated, my voice resonating with final, absolute authority. The 7-year financial grace period is permanently revoked effective immediately. The original predatory high interest rates from your private equity lenders are instantly and retroactively applied to your entire principal balances. I leaned forward, resting my arms heavily on the polished mahogany table, looking dead into my father's wide, panicked eyes. I watched the realization of his total annihilation wash over his face. You do not owe me $900,000, Richard. I whispered, the silence in the room amplifying every single word. You owe the Apex Trust over $6 million. And because you deliberately triggered the default clause, the entirety of that massive debt is no longer subject to a multi-year payment plan. It is all due in full within 24 hours. The silence inside the massive glass-walled conference room was so absolute and so profound that I could actually hear the heavy drops of freezing rain smashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. My father Richard sat frozen in his plush executive chair, staring blankly at the original unredacted trust formation documents resting on the polished mahogany table. The arrogant, confident smirk that had been plastered across his face just a few moments ago was completely eradicated. The silence was suddenly shattered by a violent, explosive movement. Trent stood up so fast and with such aggressive force that his heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the imported marble floor. He slammed both of his hands down onto the table, causing the crystal water glasses to rattle.
"This is a complete fabrication,"
Trent screamed, his voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. He leaned his entire body weight across the wide table, reaching frantically for the weathered leather ledger. "This is an absolute lie. You are a freight manager, Harrison. You move cardboard boxes for a living. You do not have millions of dollars in liquid capital. You did not bail out my company. You are trying to bluff your way out of a legally binding confession of debt." I did not move a single muscle. I sat perfectly still, watching my older brother lose his mind. David. My modest $200 an hour attorney reacted with incredible precision. He calmly reached out and slid the thick leather ledger safely away from Trent's grasping fingers. David then opened his scuffed briefcase and pulled out a secondary file folder. He extracted a thick stack of printed bank transaction records and spread them out deliberately across the table directly in front of the highly paid corporate lawyers. "I strongly advise you to look at the routing numbers on these official financial transcripts." David said, his voice perfectly steady and entirely professional. He pointed a cheap plastic pen at the top of the pages. "These documents represent the exact digital fingerprints of the Apex Trust operational accounts over the last 7 years. David looked directly into Trent's wild, panicked eyes. "For the past 7 years, every single dollar your technology startup received to cover its operating expenses originated from these exact routing numbers. The venture capital you thought you were securing was actually a direct private transfer from the Apex Trust. Every single dollar you collected as a salary, every massive bonus you paid yourself to lease your white Tesla, and every single penny you spent to fund your lavish downtown launch parties came directly from the man sitting right across from you. Harrison is the sole manager of the trust. He owns your entire corporate existence." Trent stared down at the highlighted routing numbers. His chest began to heave violently as the catastrophic reality finally penetrated his massive ego. He recognized his own specific payroll routing digits. He recognized the exact dates and the exact financial distributions. He looked like a man who was suddenly suffocating. He staggered backward away from the mahogany table, stumbling clumsily over his overturned leather chair. He hit the thick glass wall of the conference room and slid down slowly until he was sitting on the cold marble floor. His perfect custom-tailored navy blue suit was completely disheveled. The arrogant visionary tech founder was entirely gone. He was instantly reduced to a terrified, fraudulent little boy who finally realized his entire life was completely owned by the brother he despised. Sterling. The expensive corporate attorney closed his pristine legal pad with a sharp, deliberate snap. He did not say a single word to my father. He did not offer any legal counsel or strategic advice. Sterling simply gathered his gold pens and his neat legal folders, moving with urgent professional efficiency. Richard snapped out of his stunned paralysis. He reached out and grabbed Sterling's tailored sleeve with a shaking hand. Richard demanded to know exactly what his lawyer was doing. He ordered Sterling to sit back down and fix this immediate disaster. He told Sterling to file an injunction to freeze the Apex Trust and protect the family estate. Sterling pulled his arm away with a look of pure, absolute professional disgust. He looked down at my father as if Richard were a toxic disease. "I was hired by this firm to collect a simple, documented family debt," Sterling stated, his voice dripping with venom. "I was not hired to participate in the fraudulent extortion of a primary secured creditor. You sat in my office and explicitly lied to me regarding your actual financial standing and your asset ownership. You failed to disclose that you were completely insolvent and entirely dependent on a private trust fund for your basic survival." Sterling pointed a harsh, accusing finger at the extortion paperwork my parents had just eagerly signed. "You just manipulated my legal team into drafting a binding extortion document against the very entity that holds the mortgage to your own home. You legally triggered the default clause on your own multi-million-dollar debt. I am officially dropping you as clients effective immediately." Do not ever contact this firm again. You will be receiving a massive comprehensive bill for my wasted time." Sterling and his two silent associates turned around and walked briskly out of the conference room. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind them, leaving my family entirely defenseless, completely unrepresented, and utterly alone with me. The structural collapse of their flashy illusion was now absolute. The reality of the situation crashed down on my parents with the force of a falling building. The massive protective wall of high society wealth they had aggressively maintained for decades simply vaporized into thin air. Patricia looked frantically around the empty, luxurious chairs where her expensive lawyers had been sitting just seconds before. She reached up with trembling fingers and clutched the heavy string of pearls resting against her collarbone as if she were desperately trying to anchor herself to her fading reality. Her perfectly composed and heavily lifted face began to violently contort. Her lips quivered. The arrogant, cruel mask she had worn to mock Claire and belittle my entire existence completely melted away. Patricia buried her face in her manicured hands and burst into loud, uncontrollable sobs. Her tears ruined her expensive makeup, causing dark streaks to run down her pale cheeks. She cried out my name over and over again. She begged me to tell her this was just a terrible temporary joke. She pleaded with me to say I was just trying to teach them a harsh lesson about family loyalty, and that I would never actually take their beautiful home away from them. She was not crying for me. She was crying because she knew she was about to lose her elite country club friends, her prestigious social status, and her entire fake identity. Richard tried desperately to speak, but his voice completely failed him. The man who had terrorized me my entire life, the man who had mercilessly frozen my bank accounts and gleefully stolen my car just to teach me a lesson, was now physically shaking in his chair. His arrogant, dominant posture totally collapsed. He slumped forward over the wide table, staring blankly at the extortion paperwork he had just proudly signed. He realized exactly what that signature meant. By attempting to ruin me and drain my future wife's family wealth, he had legally and permanently triggered the morality and default clause. The Apex Trust was now legally obligated to immediately seize the massive suburban estate where he slept every single night. He was going to lose his prestigious golf memberships. He was going to lose his imported luxury cars. His entire retirement was completely gone. He was going to be thrown out onto the freezing Chicago streets with absolutely nothing to his name except the clothes on his back. Richard looked up at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with pure, unadulterated panic. He stammered frantically, trying to find the right sequence of words to save his life. He reached his trembling hands across the polished wood toward me. "Harrison, please, you have to stop this," Richard begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We gave you life. We raised you under our roof. You cannot take our home away from us. Where are we supposed to go? What are we supposed to do? You cannot make your own mother and father homeless. Please, son, have some mercy. We are family." Trent crawled up from the marble floor, desperately grasping the edge of the mahogany table to pull himself to his feet. He looked at me with pure, absolute terror shining in his eyes. He begged me not to revoke the proprietary software licenses for his technology company. He said his entire identity was completely tied to that business. He told me he would be completely ruined in the tech industry, and that his investors would personally sue him into oblivion for massive corporate fraud. He promised he would call a press conference and give me full public credit for saving the company 7 years ago. He promised he would make me a senior controlling partner. He pleaded with me to just give him one more chance to make things right and act like a real brother. I sat back in my leather chair and looked at the three of them. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt absolutely no guilt. My heart was perfectly calm and completely steady. They were not crying because they genuinely regretted how they had treated me. They were not crying because they suddenly realized they had been terrible, abusive, narcissistic parents. They were only crying because they had finally lost their money and their power. They had happily hired a locksmith to lock me out of my own home in the freezing rain just last night. They had gladly tried to destroy my future with the beautiful woman I loved. They had actively and enthusiastically tried to frame me for a felony and send me to federal prison just to protect their own fragile, massive egos. They wanted to destroy me simply because I refused to pay a fake $900,000 invoice for the basic biological act of raising me. I slowly stood up from the heavy leather chair. I picked up the rusted 7-year ledger, the undeniable physical proof of their salvation and their ultimate destruction, and placed it carefully back inside my briefcase. I closed the metal latches with 2 loud, definitive clicks. I looked down at Richard, who was still reaching his shaking hands across the table, begging for financial salvation. I looked at Patricia, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her designer silk scarf, grieving for her lost country club life. I looked at Trent, who was standing weakly against the glass wall waiting for a bailout that was never going to come. "You told Claire that I was a parasite," I said, my voice echoing cleanly and powerfully through the massive empty room. "You went to her parents' house in Ohio and told them I was a dangerous criminal. You froze my bank accounts and you stole my vehicle. You tried to bill me $900,000 for the simple privilege of growing up in your shadow. You demanded that I pay you for my very existence." I buttoned my damp suit jacket and picked up my briefcase by the sturdy leather handle. Claire stood up right beside me. She held her head incredibly high, completely untouched by their pathetic, desperate display of grief. She did not look at them with any sympathy. She only looked at me with total, absolute pride. We had walked into this building entirely alone, facing total ruin, and we were walking out as the absolute owners of their entire reality. I looked my father directly in his terrified, weeping eyes. I leaned forward, resting my free hand firmly on the mahogany table right next to the extortion papers he had signed. I looked at him and I mirrored the exact cruel words he had used against me at the fancy steakhouse just 1 night ago. "I am sorry, Richard," I whispered, the absolute finality of the words hanging heavily in the cold air of the conference room. "But you have been a financial burden to me long enough. It is time you clear your ledger." 3 months passed since the heavy doors of that downtown legal conference room clicked shut behind me. The absolute destruction of my family's fabricated empire did not happen overnight, but when the collapse finally began, it was a spectacular and unstoppable avalanche. The legal machinery of the Apex Trust moved with cold mechanical precision. Because Richard and Trent had voluntarily signed a binding extortion addendum on the official public record, there was absolutely no prolonged court battle. There was no desperate media campaign. There was simply the swift and brutal execution of a flawless corporate trap that had been waiting patiently for 7 long years. Trent was the very first to fall. The morning after the mediation, I officially revoked the intellectual property licenses that allowed his flashy technology startup to operate. Without that underlying software, his entire business evaporated into thin air. His servers went completely dark. His massive downtown penthouse office was locked by the property managers for unpaid commercial rent. When his aggressive private investors realized that Trent owned absolutely zero hard assets, and that his entire corporate identity was a hollow shell, they turned on him with terrifying speed. They forced him into a brutal, involuntary bankruptcy. The white luxury Tesla he had proudly paraded around the parking garage was unceremoniously repossessed in the middle of the night. Today, the former golden child of the Chicago technology scene works at a discount electronics retail store in a dying suburban shopping mall. He spends 40 hours a week wearing a cheap blue synthetic polo shirt, asking angry customers if they would like to purchase extended warranties on flat-screen televisions. He has no venture capital. He has no press releases. He has exactly the life he always truly deserved. The fallout for my parents was far more profound and infinitely more humiliating. Richard and Patricia desperately tried to fight the default execution, but their situation was entirely hopeless. Sterling, their former expensive corporate attorney, completely refused to return their frantic phone calls. Every other high-powered law firm in the city took one look at the ironclad morality and default clause and immediately declined to represent them. The compounded $6 million debt swallowed their fabricated high society lifestyle whole. The Apex Trust seized the sprawling 6-bedroom suburban estate. The property was liquidated at a private auction. Their imported luxury vehicles were seized. Their prestigious country club formally and publicly revoked their membership, citing a severe lack of financial standing and months of unpaid membership dues. They were completely exiled from the wealthy elite circles they had worshipped their entire lives. They were forced to downsize their entire existence into a few cardboard boxes. With their retirement accounts completely drained and their credit scores absolutely ruined, they had very few housing options left in the city. They eventually had to sign a lease for a cramped, poorly lit 1-bedroom apartment. It was located in a decaying brick building on the far south side of the city. Ironically, it was the exact same building on the exact same floor where I had lived in my early 20s. It was the very same modest apartment complex they used to relentlessly mock at family dinners. It was the same building where they had once tried to manipulate my landlord into evicting me just to force me to move back under their toxic control. Now Patricia spends her days staring at water stains on a low ceiling while Richard rides the public bus to buy cheap groceries. The poetic justice of their new reality was absolute, and I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I had carried their financial burdens for 7 years. My ledger was finally clear. As their world crumbled into dust, my own life was completely restored. The fabricated criminal charges against me were instantly dismissed the moment David, my brilliant attorney, presented the unredacted trust documents to the local authorities. The police realized immediately that Richard had filed a malicious and entirely fraudulent report. A week later, I received a very different phone call from my corporate employer. Robert, the vice president of operations, and Diane, the director of human resources, asked me to meet them for an expensive apology lunch. They handed me a check for all of my lost back pay and desperately offered me a massive promotion to the executive board. They had realized that a man capable of orchestrating a multi-million-dollar shadow trust was exactly the kind of logistical genius they needed running their national supply chain. I graciously accepted the check for my back pay, but I politely declined the new position. I no longer needed to work 80-hour weeks moving freight for other people. I had a massive private holding company to manage and a new life to build. The most important restoration, however, happened a few days later. William, my fiancée's billionaire father, flew his private corporate jet back to Chicago. He did not bring his intimidating lawyers or his thick leather binders. He drove a rented car to my modest temporary office and asked to meet with me entirely alone. He walked into the room, taking off his expensive wool overcoat, and he did something I never expected a man of his immense power to do. He extended his hand and he profoundly apologized. William told me he had been completely blinded by his own parental fear. He admitted that when Richard and Patricia had come to his home weeping and presenting fake police reports, his protective instincts had completely overridden his logical judgment. But after watching the Apex Trust systematically and legally dismantle my toxic family over the last few weeks, William realized exactly who he was dealing with. He looked me directly in the eye and told me that the morality and default clause was the single most brilliant piece of defensive corporate structuring he had ever seen in his 4 decades of business. He said he finally understood why Claire had been so absolutely willing to walk away from her inheritance to stand by my side. He recognized that I was not just a man of profound strategic intelligence, but a man of immense unwavering integrity. I shook his hand and I accepted his apology. I understood that he had only acted out of a desperate desire to protect his daughter, but I also made it perfectly clear that my family would never be allowed to dictate our future again. William agreed completely. 3 months after the engagement dinner that nearly destroyed everything, Claire and I finally got married. We did not hold the ceremony in a lavish downtown ballroom or a massive high society country club. We did not hire a celebrity event planner or invite hundreds of wealthy strangers we barely knew. We chose a quiet, beautiful botanical garden filled with blooming white roses and tall, ancient oak trees. The afternoon sun filtered through the green canopy, casting a warm, golden glow over the small gathering of people who actually mattered to us. William walked Claire down the stone pathway. She looked absolutely breathtaking in a simple, elegant white gown, her smile radiating pure, genuine joy. Victoria. Her mother sat in the front row, wiping happy tears from her cheeks with a lace handkerchief. My lawyer David was sitting a few rows back, raising a glass of sparkling cider in my direction. There was no dark tension in the air. There was no anxiety about what passive-aggressive insults might be hurled during the reception. Richard was not there. Patricia was not there. Trent was not there. For the first time in my 34 years of life, I was completely entirely free from their toxic shadow. As I stood at the altar holding Claire's hands and looking into her eyes, I finally understood the absolute truth about what family actually means. I spent my entire childhood and most of my adult life desperately trying to earn the love of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I thought that if I was quiet enough, reliable enough, and successful enough, they would eventually see my value. I thought that secretly saving them from total financial annihilation would eventually balance the scales. But toxic people do not keep honest ledgers. They only measure what they can take from you, and they will brutally punish you the exact moment you stop paying their emotional and financial tolls. True wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the custom-tailored suits you wear, the imported luxury vehicles you lease, or the massive estates you use to impress your shallow friends. True wealth is the quiet, solid integrity you build in the dark when absolutely no one else is watching you. It is the ability to do the right thing even when you are treated terribly. It is the strength to walk away from the people who share your blood when they refuse to share your basic human decency. Blood does not make a family. Blood is just a biological accident. Loyalty, respect, and unconditional trust are the only things that truly create a family. Claire and I built our new life on a foundation of absolute truth. The rusted, heavy steel firebox no longer sits in a forgotten, freezing storage unit on the edge of the city. I moved it into my private home office. I keep it sitting directly on my desk as a daily reminder. It reminds me that sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry are actually the exact weapons we need to set ourselves completely free. It reminds me that you can lose absolutely everything in a single night and still wake up the next morning with the power to rewrite your entire destiny. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace, hit that like button and share this story. Drop a comment below about the moment you finally stood your ground, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories about surviving the people who are supposed to love you.